Emma's pulse was erratic, her breaths coming in sharp, desperate gasps. Lila stood there in the doorway, her unnatural smile never wavering. The room felt colder with every passing second, the shadows crawling closer as if they were alive, waiting to devour her whole. What do you mean?" Emma stammered, trying to back away from the girl who wasn't truly Lila, but something darker, something that had never been human. "What's happening?" Lila's smile stretched wider. "You sealed the curse for a reason, didn't you? You thought you could end it, erase the past, make everything go away. But curses, Emma, curses are never truly gone. They follow you, they change you. And now you're part of it, whether you like it or not." Emma's head spun as she tried to make sense of the words. No, this can't be real. You're not real. She cut herself off, the reality of the situation settling in like a weight on her chest. This wasn't the Lila she had known, the quiet, almost invisible roommate she had shared a dorm with. This was something else, something much darker. Lila took a step forward, her eyes narrowing. "I told you, you can't escape it. The curse was never meant to be broken. It needed a vessel, a host. And you," she trailed off, her gaze lingering on Emma's face. "You were always going to be it." A wave of nausea swept over Emma as the room seemed to tilt, everything becoming distorted and alien. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to pulse, as if the walls themselves were alive, feeding on her fear. She forced herself to stand, even as the air grew thick and heavy. "I don't," Emma's voice cracked, her throat dry. "What do you want from me?" Lila's eyes darkened, her smile fading into something more sinister. "What do I want?" she echoed, her voice sharp and cold. "I want nothing from you, Emma. You're already part of the curse. I'm here to make sure you understand that." She paused, then took another step forward, "and to remind you that you can't outrun what's been set in motion." The words echoed in Emma's mind like a drumbeat, each one a reminder that there was no escape. She had thought she had sealed it away, that she had destroyed the source of the curse, but she hadn't understood. She hadn't known that the curse was not a simple thing to break, nor had she realized that it wasn't just tied to Lila's journal, but to something older, something far more dangerous. Her fingers tingled with the memory of the box and the blade, the price she had paid. But even now, even as she stood on the precipice of a new terror, she knew she had made the right choice. Or at least, she had thought she had. But as Lila advanced, her form distorting in the dim light, Emma began to realize the horrible truth. There was no breaking free. There was no victory, no redemption. The curse was not something that could be sealed. It was something that had to be embraced. That night, Emma didn't sleep. She couldn't. Every time she closed her eyes, the image of Lila's twisted face would appear in her mind, along with the terrible sound of the thing in the shadows, scratching, waiting. The next day, she woke to find the dorm room unchanged. No sign of Lila, no sign of the creature. Everything was as it had been before the nightmare had begun. But something was different. The air in the room felt thick, oppressive, as if the walls themselves were closing in. Emma sat up slowly, rubbing her eyes. Her head ached, and her palm throbbed where the blade had cut her. She glanced at the mirror across the room and froze. Her reflection was wrong. There was something in her eyes, something dark. She leaned closer, staring at her own face as though she might find an answer in the glass. But the reflection stared back, its expression neutral, its eyes wide and empty. Her breath hitched as she realized something was happening to her. Something she couldn't explain. Her body felt foreign, as though it didn't belong to her anymore. The scar on her palm, where the blood had spilled, now pulsed faintly, almost as though it were alive. As the days passed, Emma began to notice more changes. Little things at first. She couldn't sleep. She couldn't eat. Every moment felt like she was being watched, even when she was alone. The feeling of something crawling under her skin was constant, like the curse was slowly seeping into her very being. One night, as she sat in the dorm's common area, she overheard a conversation between two students who were talking about Lila. They spoke in hushed tones, unaware of Emma sitting nearby. "I heard she transferred out, moved back home, or something," one of them said. "That's weird," the other replied. "She was so quiet, but she was definitely here a couple of days ago. I swear I saw her." Emma's heart skipped a beat. Lila was here? The girl had vanished, left without a trace, just as the creature had promised. But now, hearing the students talk about her, Emma realized something. Lila wasn't gone. She was still in the building. She was still here. Late that night, Emma couldn't take it any longer. She needed answers. She had to find Lila, confront whatever dark entity had taken her place, and figure out what was happening to her. She quietly grabbed her jacket and slipped out of the dorm, moving down the dark, quiet hallways. The campus was eerily still, the only sound the echo of her footsteps against the cold floor. She made her way toward the building where Lila's room had been. It felt like an impossible decision, but Emma knew she had no other choice. The walls, the curse, the creature, it was all connected, and she needed to confront it head-on. She reached Lila's old room and paused outside the door. The air around her felt heavy, thick with dread. But she couldn't stop now. She pushed the door open. Inside, everything was exactly as she remembered it, uncomfortably neat, as though nothing had ever disturbed it. But there was something different about the air. It was colder, almost suffocating, as if the room itself was holding its breath. And then, in the far corner of the room, Emma saw it. The reflection of Lila in the mirror, her eyes wide and vacant. "Lila," Emma whispered, stepping forward. But the girl in the mirror didn't respond. Instead, the reflection began to shift. The face in the glass twisted and warped, becoming something darker, something unrecognizable. Emma recoiled, a cold shiver running down her spine. This wasn't Lila. It was something else. The thing in the mirror smiled, its expression stretching grotesquely. Emma took a step back, her heart hammering in her chest as she stared at the thing in the mirror. The smile that stretched across its face was too wide, its teeth jagged and sharp, and the eyes, those hollow, dark eyes, seemed to pierce right through her. It wasn't Lila. It couldn't be. She swallowed hard, forcing herself to take another step back. Her legs felt weak, like they might give way at any moment. The creature in the mirror remained still, its grin never faltering, but it was clear to Emma that it wasn't just a reflection. It was something real, something alive. Her mind raced. What was this? Was this the curse Lila had mentioned? Was this the thing that had taken control of Lila? Was it the same thing that had nearly killed her in the basement? The same force that had tormented her since she found the journal? "Lila," Emma breathed, her voice barely audible. "What happened to you?" The creature in the mirror twitched, and Emma flinched, instinctively raising her arm to shield her face. Then, as if it had been waiting for her to speak, it began to move. Slowly, deliberately, the thing pushed its hand out from the mirror, its long, bony fingers stretching toward Emma. Emma froze, unable to move, her entire body paralyzed with fear. The hand inched closer, the air growing colder with every passing second. She couldn't breathe, couldn't think. All she could do was watch as the fingers extended further, reaching for her, coming closer until, with a sudden gut-wrenching scream, the creature pulled itself free from the mirror, its body twisting and contorting in unnatural ways. It fell to the floor with a sickening thud, landing on all fours like a predatory animal, its eyes still locked on Emma. The room seemed to warp and twist around her, the walls bending inward, suffocating her. "Lila," Emma whispered again, her voice trembling. "What are you?" The creature tilted its head, as though considering the question. Then it spoke. Its voice was low, raspy, and disturbingly familiar, yet not at all like Lila's. "I was never Lila," it rasped, its voice a horrifying echo of something long dead. "I was always waiting, watching in the shadows." Emma stumbled backward, her breath coming in frantic gasps. She felt her heart racing in her chest, a sense of utter dread filling her entire being. The thing in front of her, the thing that had once been Lila, was something far worse. It wasn't a curse anymore. It was an entity, an ancient force that had somehow latched onto Lila, using her as a vessel for its darkness. And now it had turned its attention to Emma. "You," Emma's voice was hoarse, her thoughts clouded with terror. "You were the curse." The creature let out a low, guttural laugh, its mouth splitting open unnaturally wide. "You think you can escape me," it hissed. "You are mine now, Emma. Your blood, your fear, everything about you belongs to me. You can't run. You can't hide." In a desperate bid for survival, Emma turned and fled from the room. She sprinted down the hallway, her breath ragged and desperate, but the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, and far too close, echoed behind her. She didn't dare look back. She couldn't. As she reached the stairs, a familiar voice rang out, cutting through the panic in her mind. "Emma!" She spun around to see a figure standing at the top of the stairs. It was Lila, or at least the person who looked like her. But there was no warmth in her eyes now, only a cold, empty void. "Lila!" Emma gasped, her body trembling. "What happened to you?" Lila's lips parted in a smile, but it was the same twisted grin Emma had seen in the reflection. "I told you," she whispered. "You can never escape it. You belong to me now, too." Before Emma could respond, the creature surged forward, faster than she could react. It knocked her to the ground with a force that left her winded, its sharp claws digging into her skin as it pressed its weight down upon her. Its breath was hot and rancid against her ear, and Emma could feel its foul presence consuming her, enveloping her in a cold, suffocating darkness. You can't," Emma gasped, struggling to breathe. "Please, just let me go." The creature only laughed, its voice echoing with malice. "It's too late for that, Emma. You were always meant to be part of this. You were always going to belong to me." Suddenly, a bright light flooded the hallway. Emma squinted, blinking in the harsh brightness, and saw a figure approaching through the haze. It was a man, tall and dressed in dark clothing. His face was obscured by a hood, but Emma could feel the strange sense of familiarity emanating from him. The creature hissed as the light grew brighter, retreating from the figure like a vampire to sunlight. "You're not supposed to be here," the creature snarled, its voice filled with fury. The figure stepped closer, and Emma could hear him speaking in a low, almost inaudible tone. "You're not in control anymore. It ends now." The creature growled, its form twisting violently as it recoiled from the light. It looked up at the man, its eyes filled with hatred, before it slithered back into the shadows, disappearing as quickly as it had come. The figure turned toward Emma, his face still hidden in the shadows. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice steady and calm. Emma nodded weakly, still shaking from the encounter. Who are you?" He stepped into the light, revealing his face, a man she didn't recognize, but there was something about him that felt strangely comforting. "I'm here to help," he said quietly. "You've been marked, but I can remove the curse." "I can help you." Emma's heart raced. "The curse? It's not over, is it?" "No," the man replied. "It's not over. Not yet. But we can end it, once and for all." Emma took a shaky breath, trying to calm the tremors running through her body. Her mind was a whirlwind of confusion and terror. The creature, the curse, It all seemed so impossible. She had thought she could escape, that somehow the worst was over. But now, she realized she had only just begun to unravel the true horror that had bound her. "Who are you?" she asked again, her voice desperate, barely above a whisper. "How can you help me?" The man didn't immediately answer, instead looking at her with a gaze that seemed to pierce right through her. He took a step closer, his movements deliberate and careful, as though he was measuring her reaction. The air around them was thick, the silence in the hallway oppressive. Emma could feel the weight of everything, the curse, the entity that had taken Lila, the nightmare she couldn't escape, bearing down on her, and it was all too much. "I've been tracking it," the man said finally, his voice low but steady. "The entity that has been following you, that has latched onto Lila, and now you. It's ancient, powerful, and it feeds off fear, off your despair. It's been looking for a way to take full control of you. You've already started to see the signs." Emma blinked, trying to absorb his words. Tracking it? That was impossible. No one could track something like this. No one could know what was really happening. Could they? "I don't understand," she said, her voice barely audible. "What's happening to me? Why me? Why Lila?" The man's expression softened, though there was a darkness to his gaze that unsettled Emma even more. "You've been marked, Emma. This curse, it's not just something random. It's a ritual, an ancient curse that has been passed down for generations. Lila wasn't just a victim, she was part of it. And now, so are you." Emma's chest tightened as the weight of his words sank in. Marked. She thought back to the journal, to the knife, to the blood on her palm. She hadn't been able to make sense of it then, but now it all seemed to fit, like pieces falling into place. She had thought she could escape, that everything would be okay. But it was never going to be okay. "Why me?" she asked again, more forcefully this time, as if the answer might somehow free her from the suffocating grip of fear that held her. The man sighed, his shoulders heavy with the burden of the knowledge he carried. "You were always meant to be the next vessel. The curse doesn't end with one person, it passes on. Lila was a vessel, and now you are. But there's a way to break it." Emma's eyes widened as a spark of hope flickered within her. There's a way to break it. She had to know more. She had to do whatever it took to rid herself of this nightmare, to stop it from consuming her completely. "Tell me," she whispered urgently. "Please tell me how." The man nodded, but his face remained grim. "There's a place, hidden deep in the woods, where the ritual can be reversed. But you can't do it alone. The curse feeds on isolation. It thrives when you're alone, when it can drive you mad. You need someone who understands the curse to guide you." Emma's mind raced. A place deep in the woods? A ritual to reverse the curse? It sounded almost too simple, too good to be true. But she had no choice. She couldn't fight it on her own. "Who's going to help me?" she asked, her voice trembling. The man paused for a long moment before answering, his expression unreadable. "I will." Emma stared at him, her thoughts spinning. He didn't look like someone who could help her. There was something almost distant about him, as if he had been involved in this for far too long. But she had no other option. If there was any chance to break free of this curse, she had to take it. "I'm in," she said, her voice shaking but determined. The man nodded once, the faintest hint of approval in his eyes. "Good, but we need to leave now. The curse is already working against you. The longer we wait, the harder it will be to break free." Without another word, he turned and began to walk down the hallway. Emma followed quickly, still feeling a cold dread gnawing at her insides. The air around them felt heavy, charged with an oppressive energy, as though something was watching them, waiting for the right moment to strike. They moved quickly through the dark, quiet hallways, the man's footsteps sure and steady. Emma tried to focus on her breathing, trying to push aside the fear that threatened to overwhelm her. But every corner, every shadow seemed to pulse with a malevolent presence. She could feel it closing in on her. As they neared the exit of the dorm building, Emma felt the temperature drop, and the air grew thick with the sense of something wrong. She turned her head and saw a shadow move at the edge of her vision, and her heart skipped a beat. It was him, the thing that had been Lila. The creature was lurking in the hallway, watching them. The man beside her noticed it too, his hand going to the small bag at his side. He didn't speak, but Emma could feel the tension in his body as he prepared for whatever was about to come. The creature's form materialized fully in the hallway, its eyes glowing with an otherworldly light. It hissed, a sound that made Emma's skin crawl, and its mouth stretched open, revealing rows of jagged teeth. "You can't leave," it growled, its voice a low, menacing rumble. "You belong to me." The man stepped forward, his posture tense but resolute. "We don't belong to you. This ends tonight." Emma's breath quickened. She had no idea what the man was going to do, but she had no choice but to trust him. This was their only chance. The creature lunged at them, its body twisting unnaturally as it surged forward, its claws outstretched, ready to tear them apart. The man reached into his bag and pulled out an object, a small vial, filled with a glowing liquid. He held it up, and the creature stopped in its tracks, its eyes narrowing. "This ends now," he said, his voice low and commanding. With a swift motion, he threw the vial at the creature, and it shattered upon impact. The liquid splashed over the creature, and it screeched, its form convulsing violently as the light from the vial seemed to sear it from the inside out. Emma watched, wide-eyed and horrified, as the creature writhed and twisted, its body slowly disintegrating into nothingness, leaving only a trail of black smoke behind. As the last of the creature vanished, the air in the hallway seemed to lift, the oppressive weight lifting from Emma's chest. She exhaled a breath she hadn't realized she had been holding. "Is it over?" she whispered, her voice hoarse from fear. The man nodded, his face grim but determined. "For now. But the curse is never truly gone. It's just waiting for the next chance to strike." Emma stood there for a moment, trying to steady her breath, but the lingering sense of dread clung to her. The man's words echoed in her mind. The curse is never truly gone. Was this truly over, or was this just the beginning of something far worse? She wanted to believe it was over, that she could return to some semblance of normalcy, but the nagging fear inside her wouldn't let her. "Who are you?" Emma asked again, her voice still trembling. "How did you know how to stop it?" The man looked at her, his eyes dark with a mixture of sorrow and determination. He seemed to hesitate for a moment, as if weighing whether or not to reveal the truth. Then, with a deep sigh, he spoke. "My name is Gabriel," he said, his voice rough but clear. "I've been hunting this curse for years. It's not just in this town or this school. It's an ancient entity, one that's been around for centuries, moving from one person to the next, feeding off their fear, their suffering. It's tied to blood, to rituals, and once it latches on, it doesn't let go." Emma's heart sank. She had thought she was alone in this, just a victim of some twisted accident. But now she understood. She had been marked, chosen, for something much darker and more sinister than she could have ever imagined. And worse, it seemed like she was caught in the middle of something far bigger than herself. "I don't understand," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "How did it come to me? Why me out of everyone?" Gabriel's expression darkened, and he glanced around them as if expecting the shadows to close in once more. "It's never random. You were chosen because of the bloodline you carry. It goes back generations. Your family, they were involved in the rituals. Somewhere in your past, someone made a pact, and you're the one who carries the weight of that decision." Emma's mind reeled. My family? I don't know anything about this. My parents never mentioned anything about a curse, about rituals. Gabriel's lips pressed into a thin line. Of course they didn't. The people who are marked don't remember it. The curse makes sure of that. It erases the memories, but the connection is still there, buried deep. And when it comes for you, when it finds you, that's when it all starts to resurface. Her head spun with the weight of the revelation. Her entire life had been shaped by something she had never known, something that had been hidden from her family. The question was no longer just about surviving. It was about understanding what this curse was, how deep it ran, and how she could fight it. But that seemed impossible. "I'm not strong enough for this," Emma said softly, her voice faltering as the overwhelming burden threatened to crush her. "I don't know how to stop it. I've already lost Lila. I almost lost myself." Gabriel took a step toward her, his eyes softening for a moment. "You're stronger than you think. The curse thrives on fear and isolation. That's how it gains control. You don't have to do this alone, Emma. There are others like me who are trying to stop it. You just need to trust the right people." Emma's mind raced. Others? She had been alone for so long, trapped in her own fear, believing that no one could understand what she was going through. But now, Gabriel was telling her there was a chance, telling her that help might actually be available. "What do I have to do?" she asked, her voice filled with determination now. If there was even a slim chance of breaking this curse, she would take it. She couldn't go on like this. Not with the haunting presence of that thing always lurking in the shadows. Gabriel's eyes hardened, and he nodded, his expression firm. "We need to find the source of the curse, the place where it all began. The ritual's power is strongest there, and it's where the curse was originally sealed. If we can destroy it at its core, we can stop it from spreading. But be warned, the closer we get to the source, the more dangerous it becomes." Emma didn't hesitate. "Let's go!" Without another word, Gabriel turned and led the way out of the building, Emma following close behind. The night air was cool, the streets eerily quiet as they made their way toward the woods. The further they walked, the more Emma could feel the weight of the darkness pressing in around them. The curse wasn't gone. It was only lying in wait, preparing to strike again. She could feel it. The path leading into the woods was overgrown, the trees towering above them like silent sentinels. The ground was damp beneath their feet, the scent of earth and decay heavy in the air. Emma's mind kept drifting back to Lila, to the things that had happened to her, to the twisted creature that had taken her over. "What happened to Lila?" Emma asked, unable to keep the question in. How did she get possessed by that thing? Gabriel's expression darkened again, his face shadowed by the trees. Lila was just the first. It took her, yes, but it was always after more. The entity was using her as a vessel, feeding off her fear, and then it came for you. But it doesn't stop. It's been around for centuries, taking one victim after another. You were just the next one on its list. Emma stopped walking for a moment, her heart pounding. But there's no way we can stop it, right? It's been around for so long. How can we possibly break it? Gabriel turned back to her, his eyes steely with resolve. We stop it by ending its reign. We have to face the source, face the darkness that created it. It's going to be hard, but we can do this. Together. Together. The word resonated in Emma's mind, a faint spark of hope beginning to ignite within her. She wasn't alone anymore. She had someone by her side who understood, who had been through this before. She wasn't going to let the curse win. They continued their trek through the woods, the air thickening with every step. The trees seemed to press in closer, their twisted limbs reaching down like gnarled hands. Emma could feel the presence again, the same cold, suffocating force she had felt in the dorm. It was watching her, waiting. She steeled herself. Whatever happened, she couldn't turn back. The curse had to end, and she would be the one to do it. As they ventured deeper into the forest, the path became increasingly narrow and overgrown, the trees closing in around them like the jaws of some ancient beast. The moonlight barely pierced the canopy above, casting everything in an eerie, muted glow. Emma felt as though the woods themselves were alive, breathing with the weight of centuries of secrets and horrors. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the crunch of their footsteps on the damp earth. Each sound seemed amplified in the stillness. Each movement felt like an invitation to something watching from the shadows. Emma glanced nervously around, her mind replaying every strange event that had led her here. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was lurking just beyond her vision, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. "How far is it?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. The air felt thick, and it was hard to tell whether it was the curse or the forest itself that was suffocating her. "Not much farther," Gabriel replied, his voice steady but carrying a hint of tension. "Stay close. This place, it doesn't like visitors." Emma swallowed, tightening her grip on the small flashlight she held. The beam of light flickered in the dark, casting long, wavering shadows on the trees. The deeper they went, the more she could feel the presence of something malevolent, something ancient and powerful that had been waiting for this moment. Waiting for her. They pressed on, the sounds of the forest growing more distant as the trees seemed to grow even thicker, until the path disappeared altogether. Gabriel moved with purpose, his steps sure and deliberate, but Emma hesitated for a brief moment, glancing back the way they had come. The forest felt wrong. There was no sound of birds, no rustling of small animals in the underbrush. It was as though the woods had swallowed the world whole. "You said this was where the ritual began," Emma said, trying to focus on something other than the rising panic clawing at her chest. "What kind of ritual? Why would anyone? Why would my family be involved in something like that?" Gabriel's expression darkened, his eyes flicking to the dark horizon ahead. "The ritual is ancient, older than you can imagine. It started with an offering to the entity that now haunts this land. It promised power, control, eternal life, but at a cost. A cost that always comes back to claim the descendants of those who started it." Emma's stomach churned. "My family? What did they offer?" Gabriel stopped for a moment, turning to face her fully. His eyes locked with hers, the intensity of his gaze almost piercing. "The bloodline. Your family made a deal long ago, a pact with the entity. It was passed down from generation to generation, the curse growing stronger with each new soul it claimed. Lila, and now you, are the inheritors of that blood, chosen to carry the weight of the curse." Emma recoiled slightly, her heart racing. "You said it was passed down. Are you saying that someone in my family wanted this? That they chose this?" Gabriel nodded slowly, his jaw clenched. "In a way, yes. There are always those who seek power, who think they can control what they don't fully understand. But the curse is not something that can be controlled. It's a force of nature, a parasite that consumes all in its path." They walked in silence for several more minutes, the air growing heavier with each step, until they finally arrived at a small clearing. The trees parted, revealing a large, weathered stone altar at the center. The altar was covered in strange symbols, worn down by time, but still visible in the moonlight. Emma felt a shiver run down her spine as she looked at it, the weight of its presence almost suffocating. "This is it," Gabriel said quietly, his voice filled with a mixture of awe and dread. "The heart of the curse." Emma's gaze lingered on the altar, her mind racing with questions. Was this really the place where it all began? Was this where she could end it? She took a tentative step forward, her breath shallow. "So, what do we do now?" Gabriel reached into his bag and pulled out a small book, bound in dark leather. The edges were frayed, the pages yellowed with age. He opened it slowly, flipping through the pages until he came to a worn and faded illustration of a similar altar. The symbols on the page matched those etched into the stone before them. "There's a ritual," Gabriel said, his voice steady but filled with urgency. "A counter-ritual that can sever the connection, break the curse. But it requires more than just a chant or a symbol. It requires sacrifice. The curse doesn't let go easily." Emma's heart skipped a beat. "Sacrifice?" she echoed, her voice trembling. "What kind of sacrifice?" Gabriel's gaze darkened, his eyes flicking briefly to the altar. "The curse feeds off fear, Emma. The stronger the fear, the more power it gains. The sacrifice is not physical. It's your fear, your willingness to face the darkness without flinching. Only then will the curse be broken." The air seemed to grow colder around them, and Emma could feel it, the presence closing in. It was as though the forest itself was alive, as though the earth beneath her feet was pulsing with the heartbeat of something ancient and terrible. "You have to face it," Gabriel continued. "The entity. You have to let it come for you, and you have to be willing to fight it. If you don't, if you hesitate, it will take you. It will take everything." Emma's breath caught in her throat. "What do I do? How do I fight it?" Gabriel closed the book with a snap, his expression grave. "You stand your ground. You do not let it control you. Do not let it feed on your fear. If you do this, the curse will break. But if you fail, if you falter—" He trailed off, his voice thick with warning. Emma nodded, her heart hammering in her chest. She had no choice. She had to do this. For Lila. For herself. She couldn't let this entity continue to haunt her, to torment her, to take any more lives. Without another word, Gabriel stepped back, giving her space. Emma stood alone in the clearing, the cold night air pressing in on her, her body trembling with a mix of fear and determination. And then she felt it. A presence, dark, suffocating, malevolent, suddenly filled the air around her. It was as though the very earth itself was alive with it. Emma's heart pounded in her chest as the temperature dropped sharply, and a shadow moved in the corner of her vision. She could hear a whispering, soft at first, but growing louder, until it seemed to echo in her mind. "Come to me, Emma." The voice was low and guttural, its tone filled with hunger. It was the entity, the thing that had haunted her from the start, and now it was here, ready to claim her. The air around Emma grew thick with a suffocating weight, the whispering voice wrapping around her like a vice, drawing her closer to the altar. The shadows seemed to bend and twist, their edges growing sharper and more defined. She could feel them creeping toward her, touching her skin with their cold, clammy fingers, but she refused to move. "Come to me, Emma." The voice echoed again, and this time she could almost feel the breath of the entity against her ear, like a cold breeze just before a storm. Her body froze, caught between the instinct to flee and the need to stand firm. She had no choice now but to face it, whatever it was. She had made a promise to herself, and now there was no turning back. Her hand tightened around the flashlight, though it seemed little more than a weak tool against the growing terror that surrounded her. She wasn't sure what she expected to happen, but she could sense that the ritual had begun. The very ground beneath her feet seemed to vibrate with the dark energy of the curse. Suddenly, the shadows coalesced, swirling around the clearing in a dark, liquid mass. It was as if the forest itself was bleeding darkness into the center of the space, pooling around her in waves of malevolent energy. Emma swallowed hard, trying to push down the surge of panic rising in her chest. "Stand your ground," Gabriel's voice cut through the air, though he was still a distance away. She didn't know if he could see what she was seeing, but the calm in his voice did little to reassure her. Face it, Emma. Face the truth. The whispering voice wrapped around her thoughts like a twisted lullaby, a sinister melody that promised nothing but pain. It was close now, so close she could feel the weight of it on her skin. The temperature had dropped drastically, and her breath came out in visible puffs as though the very air was freezing. Every shadow seemed to pulse with life, their dark forms stretching out toward her, hungry, waiting. She took a shaky step forward, willing her legs to move even as her fear clawed at her mind. The book Gabriel had shown her, the ritual it contained, was the only thing she had left. She had to believe it would work. She had to believe that facing this darkness would somehow end the curse that had haunted her, that had claimed Lila and so many others before her. "I will not fear you," Emma whispered, her voice barely audible against the rising wind that seemed to stir from the darkness itself. "It will be your undoing," the voice hissed. "Fear is your weakness. It is all that I need to take you." Emma felt the presence swirling closer, pressing against her, suffocating her with its terrible weight. Her heart pounded in her chest, each beat a deafening sound in the thick silence that surrounded her. She could see it now, the shape forming from the shadows, its form an indistinct blur at first but gradually taking shape. A figure, tall and dark, with limbs that seemed too long and twisted, its face a void of darkness, eyes nothing more than hollow pits. The entity wasn't just an image, it was real, and it was here to claim her. "You cannot escape," it whispered, the voice now a chorus of mocking tones, swirling like smoke in the air. "You are mine." She could feel its presence closing in, the terror threatening to overwhelm her. She had to do this. She had to break the curse. "No," she thought, forcing the word out through the fog of her fear. "I will not give in." With trembling hands, she reached into her pocket and pulled out the small book Gabriel had shown her. Its leather cover felt cold under her fingers, but she opened it, finding the page with the counter-ritual. The words were faded, nearly illegible, but she could make out enough to understand what she needed to do. She had to stand strong. She had to face it, no matter how badly it tried to break her. The shadows around her grew darker, the figure now fully formed and towering over her. It opened its mouth, and Emma felt her soul freeze. Its voice was a blend of all the whispers she had heard before, endless, dark, and full of malice. "You will fall, just like the others. You cannot fight me. You are mine to devour." "No," Emma said, louder this time, her voice trembling but gaining strength. She held the book tightly in her hands, forcing her voice to remain steady. "I will not fear you." The ground beneath her trembled, the air thick with the weight of the entity's power. It hissed in fury as if her defiance were a blow to its very existence. "Foolish girl," it whispered again, this time a screeching hiss that sent a chill down her spine. "I was here before you. I will remain long after you. You cannot defeat me." Emma's heart pounded in her chest as she recited the words from the book, each syllable feeling like an anchor, like something that could tether her to reality in the face of this impossible evil. She felt the words pulsing through her, through the fear, through the darkness. She wasn't alone, not anymore. The shadows around her began to ripple, the air growing heavier with the weight of the entity's wrath. It screeched, an unearthly wail that seemed to shake the very ground beneath her. The presence roared, thrashing against the force of the ritual, but Emma didn't back down. She couldn't. She closed her eyes, her breath ragged but steady. She focused on the words, each syllable a lifeline, each phrase pulling her deeper into the ritual. Her heart raced, and every part of her body screamed for release, but she held on. And then, just as it felt like the darkness would consume her, she felt it, the shift. The ground beneath her feet vibrated, the air snapped, and the shadows recoiled. A bright light flared from the center of the altar, a blinding burst that filled the entire clearing. The entity shrieked again, its form flickering and warping in the light, as if it were being pulled apart. "No," the voice screamed. "You cannot do this." But Emma's voice didn't falter as she chanted the final words of the ritual. She felt the darkness unraveling, the force weakening with each passing moment. And as she uttered the final phrase, the world seemed to collapse inward. The light consumed everything. The light seemed to stretch forever, bright and unyielding, until Emma thought her very soul might be torn from her body. She felt the darkness, once so powerful, begin to fade, crumbling under the light's intensity. The presence that had haunted her for so long, that had torn her life apart, was weakening, its form becoming more and more distorted. It howled, but the sound was no longer full of menace. Instead, it carried a sense of fear, a desperate cry for survival. The shadows, once so solid and malevolent, were now dissipating like smoke in the wind, unraveling with each word Emma spoke. The curse that had bound her, the dark force that had haunted her family for generations, was fading away, dissolving into the very air around her. Her heart raced, but she forced herself to keep chanting, the words spilling from her lips like a mantra. She had no choice but to see this through, no choice but to finish what she had started. As the last of the shadows vanished, the air grew still. The oppressive weight that had filled the forest lightened, and the eerie silence that had clung to the clearing was now replaced with the soft rustling of the trees, the gentle breeze carrying a sense of release. Emma lowered the book, her hands shaking, her breath shallow, but her heart still pounding fiercely in her chest. She had done it. The entity was gone. The curse had been broken. For a moment, Emma simply stood there, eyes wide in disbelief. Had it really happened? Had she truly faced that creature and survived? She turned slowly, her eyes seeking Gabriel. He stood at the edge of the clearing, watching her intently, his face a mixture of relief and exhaustion. "You did it," he said, his voice quiet but filled with awe. Emma nodded slowly, still trying to process the weight of what had just occurred. She had fought the entity, faced her deepest fears, and broken the cycle that had plagued her family for generations. The curse was finally over. But then, just as she was about to speak, a chilling thought crossed her mind. It wasn't just the entity she had to worry about. It wasn't just the curse that had plagued her family. There were always the consequences, the price of breaking such a powerful bond. "What happens now?" Emma asked, her voice trembling slightly despite herself. "The curse is broken, but what about everything else?" Gabriel stepped forward, his expression somber. "The ritual was powerful, Emma, but the price of breaking it is not without its toll. The forest will settle now, but it won't forget what happened. There are forces in play here that even I don't fully understand. The shadows you faced, they were only a fragment of something much older. But you stopped it. You stopped the curse." She exhaled shakily, trying to calm herself, but the sense of unease lingered. She had freed herself, but had she truly freed everyone? The darkness was gone for now, but would it return? "Will I be safe now?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Gabriel's expression softened as he met her eyes. "The curse is broken, and that's all we can be sure of for now. What happens next depends on you." Emma swallowed hard, still trying to make sense of everything. She had lived in fear for so long, wondering if the darkness would claim her, wondering if she would be next. But now, for the first time in years, there was a sense of peace in the air, a calm that felt almost surreal. And yet, as she looked around the clearing, a small, haunting thought lingered in the back of her mind. The forest had been home to something ancient, something powerful. And as much as she longed to believe that it was truly over, she couldn't shake the feeling that the darkness had merely retreated, for now. "We should go," she said finally, her voice steadier now. "Before it changes its mind." Gabriel nodded in agreement. Together, they turned and began to walk back along the path they had come, the forest no longer quite as suffocating as before, though the air still held the weight of something unsaid, something unfinished. As they made their way back toward the edge of the woods, Emma glanced over her shoulder one last time. The forest was still peaceful even, but in the distance, just beyond the tree line, she swore she saw a fleeting shadow, an indistinct figure moving in the dark, as though it had never truly gone. She shook her head, trying to dispel the thought. "It's over," she told herself. "It has to be." And yet, somewhere deep within her, Emma knew that no matter how much she wished it, the shadows would never truly vanish. The curse was broken, yes, but darkness, true darkness, never completely left. It always found a way to return. But for now she could breathe. For now she was free. The air felt unnervingly calm, and as Emma and Gabriel continued walking, a sense of dread clung to Emma like a second skin. Every crackling leaf beneath their feet, every gust of wind felt heavy with unseen eyes. The woods, though still and quiet, seemed to watch them, waiting, as though the darkness had merely receded into the corners, biding its time. The walk back felt endless, and Emma's mind raced with questions she couldn't quite answer. What had they really done? Was the ritual truly powerful enough to sever the curse, or had they simply delayed the inevitable? And that fleeting shadow she thought she saw, was it just a figment of her imagination, or had something survived in the depths of the forest? She shook her head, trying to banish the unsettling thoughts. "Focus," she told herself. "It's over. The curse is gone." But no matter how much she tried to convince herself, a nagging feeling remained, an unshakable sense that something wasn't quite right. They had done what needed to be done, but now they had to deal with the aftermath. Emma didn't feel victorious, she felt hollow. The forest behind her was peaceful, but there was a quiet tension in the air that made her skin crawl. They finally reached the edge of the woods, where the moonlight broke through the canopy and bathed the land in a silvery glow. They had made it, but the relief Emma had expected to feel didn't come. She stopped and turned to Gabriel, her gaze locking with his. He looked just as drained as she felt, his eyes shadowed with the weight of the ordeal. "Do you think we did it?" she asked quietly, her voice carrying the same doubt that gnawed at her. Gabriel didn't answer right away. He simply gazed out into the trees, his expression unreadable. When he spoke, his voice was slow, measured. "I think we've ended the curse, yes. But we've only scratched the surface, Emma. The curse was just one part of something much darker, something ancient that I can't explain." Emma's heart skipped a beat. She had feared that this would be the case. The entity she had faced had been powerful, but had it truly been the source of all the darkness? Or had it merely been a manifestation, a symptom of something much deeper and older? Her breath caught in her throat as a sickening thought struck her. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Gabriel turned to face her fully, his eyes filled with something she couldn't quite read. "There are forces in this world that we can't fully understand. The forest, the land, it's all connected to something far older than anything we know. The curse was just the first layer. The darkness you saw, the entity, it was only a small part of the greater evil that festers beneath this land." Emma felt her stomach turn. "Are you saying we haven't defeated it? That it could still come back?" Gabriel hesitated. His eyes flickered to the woods once more, as though expecting something to emerge from the shadows. "I don't know," he admitted, his voice heavy with the burden of truth. "But there's always the possibility. The ritual you completed, it broke the curse that had bound you and your family, but the land has a history that runs much deeper. We've interrupted something ancient, Emma, and there's no telling how it will react. The words hung in the air between them, heavy and suffocating. Emma's pulse quickened, and she instinctively took a step back, her gaze darting back toward the trees. The quiet of the forest felt wrong now, as if it were holding its breath, waiting. Then what do we do? Emma asked, panic beginning to creep into her voice. What if we didn't finish it? What if? Before she could finish, there was a low, guttural sound that emanated from the forest. A faint growl like the low rumble of distant thunder, but it was unmistakably alive. Emma froze, her heart hammering in her chest. She looked to Gabriel, but his face had gone pale, his eyes wide with fear. The growl came again, closer this time, and Emma felt her breath catch in her throat. It was no longer just the forest watching them. Something real was out there, moving in the dark, closing in on them. "What is that?" she whispered, her voice shaking. Gabriel grabbed her arm tightly, pulling her away from the trees. "We need to leave. Now." They broke into a run, their footsteps pounding on the soft earth, the growl still echoing in the distance. Emma's mind raced, her body numb with fear. What was chasing them? Was it the remnants of the curse, or was it something worse, something older? The path ahead blurred in the darkness, but they didn't stop. They couldn't. Emma's legs burned, but she pushed through, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She could hear it now, the sound of something large moving through the trees, its footsteps heavy and slow, as though it was savoring the chase. It's coming closer. They reached the edge of the clearing, where the safety of the town was within reach. But just as they were about to emerge from the woods, something shifted in the shadows. A figure, dark and massive, stepped out from behind the trees. Emma's breath caught in her throat as she recognized the shape, a twisted, monstrous silhouette, too large to be human. Its eyes gleamed in the dark, reflecting the faint moonlight, and Emma knew, with chilling certainty, that they weren't alone anymore. "Run!" Gabriel shouted, pulling Emma forward, but she could already hear the thing behind them, its growls growing louder, more insistent. They sprinted through the woods, the ground uneven beneath their feet, the figure, whatever it was, gaining on them. Emma dared not look back, but she could feel its presence behind her, closing in with every step. It wasn't over. It couldn't be over. Emma's legs felt like lead as she pushed herself harder, each step becoming more laborious than the last. Her breath came in shallow gasps, and the sound of her heart pounding in her ears drowned out everything else. But behind her, the growl, the low, primal growl, was growing louder, the ground beneath her feet trembling with the approaching force. She risked a glance over her shoulder, her blood running cold as she caught a glimpse of it, the creature emerging from the shadows. Its form was massive, its body a twisted amalgamation of shapes, long limbs extending unnaturally as it glided through the darkness. Its eyes, glowing like twin orbs of fire, locked onto her, and Emma felt a surge of terror unlike anything she had ever known. It was like nothing human, nothing she could explain, and it was coming for them. "Faster!" Gabriel's voice was urgent, desperate. He pulled her forward, but Emma's feet were barely responding. Panic was setting in, and the dread clawing at her insides was overwhelming. She had thought they were free. She had thought the curse was broken. But this was something else. Something older, something that the curse had only been a symptom of. They were being hunted. The woods seemed endless, the path stretching out before them like an insurmountable wall. The dark shape behind them was relentless, closing in with every stride. Emma's eyes darted wildly as they ran, searching for a way out, a sign of safety. But the forest felt alive, as if it was pressing in on them, closing off their escape with every turn. Another growl echoed through the trees, this one closer, almost on top of them. Emma's heart leaped into her throat as she heard the sound of snapping branches. Something massive was crashing through the forest, gaining on them with terrifying speed. She could hear its breath now, ragged and wet, like something that had been lurking in the dark for centuries. And in the distance, Emma saw a flicker of light. The town, the edge of the woods. She could make it. She just had to keep going. But then, the ground beneath her feet seemed to shift, as though the earth itself was betraying her. Her foot caught on a root, and she stumbled, falling to her knees. The world spun around her, and for a split second, all she could do was gasp for air, feeling the weight of her exhaustion crashing down on her. "Emma!" Gabriel's voice snapped her back to reality. He was a few paces ahead, turning back toward her, but there was no time. The creature was too close. With a frantic push, Emma forced herself to her feet, her muscles burning with the effort. She didn't dare look back, but she could hear it now. The thing, its breath ragged and uneven, its growl vibrating in the air like a thunderclap. It was coming for them. And then she saw it, something shimmering in the distance. The glow of the streetlights from the town. They were close, so close. "Keep running!" Gabriel shouted again, his voice thick with desperation. But even as he said it, Emma could feel the air grow heavier, the weight of something dark and powerful settling around her. It was like an oppressive force, squeezing the very life out of her as the creature drew nearer. Her legs were shaking, her body refusing to cooperate, but she refused to stop. She would not be hunted. Not now. Another growl. This time, it was right behind her. Emma could feel the heat of its breath on her back, the sound of its claws scraping against the ground like jagged metal. She had no choice but to push herself harder, faster. Every breath was a struggle, but she couldn't stop now. She wouldn't. With a final burst of energy, Emma tore through the last stretch of woods and broke free into the town. The streetlights flickered overhead, their cold light cutting through the darkness, casting long shadows across the empty road. She stumbled into the middle of the street, her body screaming for rest, but she didn't dare stop. Not yet. Gabriel was at her side in an instant, his face pale with fear, his eyes scanning the woods behind them. He grabbed her arm, pulling her forward, urging her to keep moving. The town was quiet, eerily so. Not a single person was on the streets, and the buildings around them stood like silent sentinels, casting long, dark shadows. But as they continued down the road, Emma couldn't shake the feeling that the darkness had followed them here. It had crossed over from the woods, creeping along the edge of every street, waiting, watching. "Where do we go?" Emma gasped, her voice shaky and broken. "What do we do now?" Gabriel didn't answer immediately. His gaze was fixed ahead, his mind working at a frantic pace. The creature was still out there, somewhere in the darkness, hunting them. But he knew they couldn't outrun it forever. They needed a plan. They needed something to stop it. Suddenly, he turned sharply, grabbing Emma's wrist and pulling her into an alleyway between two buildings. It was narrow and dark, the walls towering over them like a trap. Emma could barely breathe as they pressed themselves into the shadows, both of them listening intently for any sign of movement. "Stay quiet," Gabriel whispered urgently. "It can't find us if we stay still." They held their breath, the air thick with tension. Emma's heart was racing, her senses heightened, every sound around her amplified in the silence. She could hear the creature now, the heavy sound of its footsteps in the distance, the rustling of trees, the occasional growl as it prowled the edge of the town. It was close, but then nothing. The silence stretched on. Seconds felt like hours. Emma strained to hear anything, her pulse pounding in her ears. Had they lost it? Was it still out there? And then, just as she was beginning to relax, a shadow flitted across the alleyway. Emma's breath hitched in her chest as the figure emerged from the darkness, its glowing eyes fixed on her. "Run," Gabriel said, barely a whisper, but Emma didn't need to be told twice. Emma didn't hesitate. She didn't look back. Every muscle in her body screamed as she sprinted down the alley, her shoes slapping against the pavement, her breath ragged and shallow. Gabriel was beside her, his hand gripping hers tightly, pulling her forward with terrifying urgency. The shadow, no, the creature, was closing in, its footsteps heavy and deliberate, like the sound of a predator stalking its prey. They burst into the open street, but the town that had seemed like a refuge just moments ago now felt like a labyrinth. The empty streets stretched out endlessly in every direction, and the sense of being trapped was overwhelming. The creature had followed them here, its presence lingering like a dark cloud, suffocating the very air around them. "Where do we go?" Emma gasped, her voice breaking as she looked around in desperation. The town was silent, eerily still, as if it had been abandoned for years. The only sound was the rapid pounding of their footsteps and the slow, predatory growl of the creature behind them. Gabriel's eyes darted around, his expression tight with fear. He knew the creature was close, but he didn't have an answer. The streets felt endless, the shadows deep and menacing. The only option was to keep moving, to find shelter, anything to give them a chance. "We need to find someplace to hide," he said, his voice low but urgent. Emma nodded, fear bubbling in her throat. She didn't care where they hid as long as it was far from that thing. But the problem was, they didn't know what the creature was, where it came from, or what it could do. All they knew was that it was relentless, and it had followed them across the woods and into the town. There was no escaping it, not unless they understood what it wanted. They ducked into a narrow street, hoping the creature hadn't seen them. Emma's eyes darted from shadow to shadow, scanning the darkened corners for any sign of movement. Every rustle of the wind made her flinch, but there was no sound of the creature's growl now. The streets remained eerily quiet. "We need to figure out what it is," Emma whispered, her voice trembling. "Why is it after us? What does it want?" Gabriel stopped abruptly, his hand pulling her to a halt. "I don't know," he said, "but I think I know where we can find out." Emma's brow furrowed in confusion. "What do you mean?" He glanced around before speaking again. "There's a library in the center of town. Old, abandoned. If there's any record of this thing, we might find it there." "The library?" Emma didn't question it. It was their only lead. She nodded, and they began moving again, faster this time, adrenaline pushing them forward. As they approached the library, the feeling of being watched grew stronger. Emma could feel eyes on her back, a weight pressing down on her chest, as if the very air was thickening with the presence of something unseen. The hairs on the back of her neck stood on end. The library was a dilapidated building, overgrown with ivy and shadowed by large trees. The door was ajar, a faint creak from the wind making the hinges groan as they approached. Gabriel stepped forward cautiously, pushing the door open a little further. "Stay close," he muttered, his voice tight. "If this thing is as old as I think it is, we need to be careful." Emma nodded and followed him inside, her heart pounding as the door creaked shut behind them. The library was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of the moon through broken windows. The shelves were covered in dust, and the air smelled musty, old, like time itself had forgotten this place. They moved deeper into the library, their footsteps muffled by the thick layers of dust on the floor. Emma couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching them, that the shadows around them were shifting just a little too much. She could almost hear the whispers of the past, the echoes of those who had come before. "Do you feel that?" Emma asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Gabriel didn't answer right away. He was scanning the room, his eyes narrowed, trying to focus on anything that could give them a clue. "It's like the air is thicker here," he muttered. "But we don't have time to waste. We need to find something." They moved to one of the back corners of the library, where a large, dusty tome lay on a table, open as if someone had been reading it before abandoning it. The cover was old, the pages yellowed with age, and the title was faded, but Emma could just make out the words, "The Wraiths of the Forgotten Land." Gabriel didn't hesitate. He flipped through the pages, his fingers trembling as he skimmed over the ancient text. Emma watched him closely, her nerves on edge as she glanced over her shoulder, expecting to see the creature at any moment. "There it is," Gabriel said suddenly, his voice sharp with recognition. He pointed to a passage. "This thing, it's called the Wraith of the Hollow. It's an ancient entity, one that feeds on fear. It can't be killed, only contained. But there's something in here about binding it to the land, locking it away." Emma's breath caught in her throat. "So, we can stop it?" Gabriel nodded, but his face was grim. "We can try, but we'll need to perform another ritual. It's the only way to keep it from following us, from destroying everything." Emma swallowed hard. "How do we do it?" "We'll need to gather specific items, things that tie this land to the curse, items that can create a bond strong enough to imprison it. But there's a catch. The ritual must be performed at the heart of the town, where the land is weakest. That's where it will be bound for good." "Where?" Emma asked, her voice tight with fear. Gabriel looked at her, his expression unwavering. "The old church." The word sent a chill through Emma's spine. The church. She had been there as a child, a place of comfort and light. But now it was nothing but a crumbling, haunted structure, like everything else in this cursed town. If that was the key to stopping the Wraith, they had to go. "We don't have much time," Gabriel said. "It's getting closer." Emma nodded, and without another word, they turned toward the exit, ready to face whatever came next. They had one chance, one shot at ending this nightmare. But as they stepped outside, the faintest sound broke the silence, a whisper carried on the wind, just loud enough for Emma to hear. "You cannot run from me." Emma's blood ran cold at the whisper, the words curling around her like a dark cloud. She froze in her tracks, her body rigid with fear. The voice wasn't Gabriel's, wasn't any voice she had ever heard before. It came from nowhere and everywhere at once, like the wind itself was speaking to her. She turned quickly, looking for any sign of the creature, but there was nothing. Just the empty streets, the crumbling buildings, the oppressive silence. But she could feel it. Its presence was like a weight pressing against her chest, suffocating her with each passing second. "We need to move," Gabriel urged, his voice strained as he pulled her forward, his grip tightening around her wrist. "It's already here." She didn't need any further prompting. They started running again, heading in the direction of the old church. The streets seemed to stretch endlessly before them, each turn, each corner, leading them deeper into the heart of the town. The shadows grew longer, the darkness more suffocating, as though the very town was conspiring against them. But the whispers, they kept coming, soft at first, like a breeze stirring through the trees, then louder, clearer, until Emma could hear them in her mind, as if they were spoken directly into her ear. "You cannot run from me. You will never escape." Her heart hammered in her chest, her legs threatening to give way beneath her. But she couldn't stop. Not now. Not when they were so close. The church. She had to get to the church. The air was thick with tension as they neared the church. Its silhouette loomed ahead, a crumbling structure surrounded by overgrown ivy and moss. The door, once a welcoming symbol of faith, now hung ajar, as if inviting them in. Emma's stomach twisted as she approached it, the sense of dread growing with every step. Gabriel hesitated at the threshold, his eyes darting around. "We have to finish this." Once we start the ritual, there's no turning back. Emma nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat. She knew they didn't have a choice. If they didn't stop the creature now, it would be the end of everything. They stepped inside, the door creaking ominously behind them as it shut. The church was dark, the air heavy with the scent of mildew and decay. The once beautiful stained glass windows were shattered, the shards of glass glinting like jagged teeth in the dim light. The pews were overturned, the altar defiled, and the altar cloth was torn, stained with something dark, something ancient. At the far end of the church, near the altar, there was a small, circular stone slab. It was covered in dust and cobwebs, but something about it called to Emma. She felt drawn to it, like it was the heart of the church, the center of whatever dark force had taken root here. "We need to prepare the items," Gabriel said, his voice tight as he rummaged through his backpack. "I'll need the salt, the candles, and the symbols from the book. We can't do this without them." Emma didn't question him. She helped gather the items, laying them out on the stone slab as he instructed. The salt went in a circle, the candles were placed at each cardinal point, and the symbols were drawn with trembling hands. The air felt thick, heavy with anticipation, as though the very walls of the church were holding their breath. "Is everything ready?" Gabriel asked, his voice tight. Emma nodded, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The whispers had grown louder, more insistent, echoing in her mind. "You think you can stop me? You cannot stop what was never meant to be stopped." A cold wind swept through the church, extinguishing the candles in an instant, leaving them in complete darkness. "No," Gabriel said sharply, panic creeping into his voice. "It's happening too fast. We have to finish it now." Emma's heart raced as she grabbed the book from the table and opened it to the ritual page. Her hands were shaking, the words on the page blurring before her eyes. The whispers had become screams now, shrill and maddening, rattling her mind. With trembling hands, she began to recite the words from the book, her voice barely a whisper. As she spoke, the air seemed to thrum with power, the ground beneath her feet trembling. The shadows around them began to writhe and twist, as if they were alive. But it wasn't enough. The floor suddenly cracked open beneath their feet, and from the fissure, a dark, skeletal hand shot out, grasping at Emma's ankle with inhuman strength. She screamed as it pulled her down, her body jerking violently. "Emma!" Gabriel shouted, rushing to grab her. But the darkness, the creature, it was already too close. Emma tried to fight it off, but the creature was too strong. It pulled her into the depths, into the blackness, and she could feel its claws, its cold, dead fingers tightening around her throat. Her vision blurred as the darkness swallowed her whole. And then, just as she thought she might lose consciousness, there was a flash of light, a brilliant, searing white light that filled the church. For a moment, everything stopped. The darkness receded, the whispers fell silent, and Emma was free. She gasped for air, her chest heaving as she looked around, disoriented. The creature was gone, its presence vanishing as if it had never been there. Gabriel pulled her up, his face pale, sweat dripping from his brow. "It worked," he said, his voice a mix of relief and disbelief. "We did it." Emma stumbled, still trying to process what had just happened. The ritual had worked, but at what cost? What had they just unleashed, and would they truly be safe? As the dust settled, Emma looked around the church, now eerily still. The sun was beginning to rise, casting a pale light through the broken windows, and she felt a strange sense of calm settle over her. But deep down, she knew it wasn't over. Not truly. The wraith had been sealed, maybe, but there were forces at work here, things far older and more powerful than either of them could understand. And somewhere in the shadows, the whispers still echoed. The silence in the church was oppressive, almost suffocating. Emma's heart was still racing as she tried to make sense of everything that had just transpired. Gabriel was standing beside her, his expression a mix of exhaustion and lingering fear. He kept glancing over his shoulder, as if expecting the creature to return at any moment. "We did it," Gabriel said, though his voice lacked conviction, as if he too was unsure of the truth of his words. Emma didn't answer immediately. She stood up slowly, feeling the weight of everything settling in her bones. The ritual had worked. At least the wraith was no longer actively pursuing them. But she couldn't shake the sense that something was still wrong, that the danger was far from over. She knew deep down that the wraith wasn't the only thing they had to worry about. Whatever had unleashed it, whatever dark force had tied the creature to this place, was still lurking in the shadows, waiting for its next opportunity. "Do you think it's really over?" she asked quietly, her voice trembling. Gabriel's eyes flicked to her, and for a moment he said nothing. Then slowly he shook his head. "I don't know. I thought if we completed the ritual, it would end. But the book, it doesn't explain everything. I've read it 100 times, and there are still things about this place, about that thing, that don't make sense." Emma swallowed hard. "So what now? What do we do?" Gabriel's gaze hardened, his jaw clenching as he looked at the altar. "We need to leave. We need to get out of here before." "Before what?" The ground beneath them trembled again. Only this time it wasn't the same subtle shaking from before. This was deeper, more forceful. The church seemed to groan under the pressure, its old wooden beams creaking ominously. Dust and debris fell from the ceiling as cracks appeared in the walls, spreading outward like veins, pulsing with a dark, unnatural energy. "Get down!" Gabriel shouted, pushing Emma to the ground just as a powerful force ripped through the church. The altar exploded in a burst of debris, sending splinters and rocks scattering across the floor. Emma screamed, her body instinctively curling into a ball to protect herself. The very air around them seemed to vibrate with the power of whatever was happening. Through the chaos, Emma's eyes were drawn to something at the far end of the church. A shadow that had been standing there all along, unnoticed until now. It was the wraith. Its form was different now. It no longer resembled a hollow, ghostly figure. The ritual had done something that Emma couldn't quite comprehend, but it wasn't enough. The wraith had evolved, had shifted, and now it stood before them, taller and more powerful than before. Its skeletal body was clothed in tattered robes that seemed to move with a life of their own, a dark mist swirling around it. Its eyes glowed with a malevolent light, and its mouth, if it could be called that, twisted into a grotesque grin. Emma's breath caught in her throat as the wraith spoke, its voice a low, guttural growl that echoed through the ruined church. "You think you've sealed me away, but you've only delayed the inevitable. This place, this land, it belongs to me." The wraith's form shifted again, its body distorting as though it were made of liquid darkness, stretching and contracting like a living nightmare. It reached out toward them, its hands elongated and twisted, claws scraping against the stone floor. "Why?" Emma shouted, her voice shaking with a mix of fear and defiance. "Why are you doing this?" The wraith tilted its head, its glowing eyes narrowing as it studied her. "You were foolish to think you could understand. The curse was never meant to be broken. It was meant to be passed down, to consume all who dared disturb this place." Before Emma could react, the wraith lunged at them, its form blurring with unnatural speed. Gabriel grabbed her arm, pulling her to her feet, but the wraith's power was overwhelming. They were thrown back, crashing into the walls of the church. Emma's head hit the stone with a sharp crack, and for a moment, everything went dark. When she opened her eyes again, she found herself lying on the cold floor, Gabriel kneeling beside her, his face pale and covered in blood. His eyes were wide with panic as he shook her, his voice frantic. "Emma! Emma, wake up!" She groaned, struggling to sit up, her vision spinning. The pain in her head was almost unbearable, but she pushed through it, forcing herself to focus. The wraith was still there, standing over them, its twisted form casting a dark shadow across the room. Gabriel pulled her to her feet, urgency flooding his movements. "We can't defeat it. Not like this. We need to leave, now." But Emma didn't want to run. Not anymore. The terror of the creature had driven her to the edge of desperation. But now, in this moment of crisis, she realized something. If they kept running, they would never escape. The wraith would keep following, always hunting them, always waiting for the right moment to strike. She looked at Gabriel, a cold determination settling in her chest. "No, we're not running anymore. We have to finish this, once and for all." Gabriel stared at her, disbelief flashing across his face. "Emma, you're out of your mind. This thing is—" "I know," Emma interrupted, her voice steady now. "But we can't let it win. We have to bind it here. For good." Gabriel hesitated, his eyes flicking to the wraith, which was now inching closer, its claws scraping against the stone. The creature's laugh echoed through the church, sending a chill down Emma's spine. "Do you have any better ideas?" Emma asked, her voice hard. Gabriel's expression flickered between fear and determination. Before he nodded, a grim resolve taking hold of him. "All right, let's finish this." Together, they made their way back to the altar, where the remnants of the ritual still lay scattered on the ground. They couldn't let the wraith stop them, not now. Not when they were so close. As they began to chant the binding incantation once more, the church seemed to come alive with dark energy. The wraith screamed in fury, thrashing as it tried to reach them. But this time they were ready. The power of the ritual surged through them, its energy coursing like electricity as the air crackled with dark light. And then, just as the wraith lunged at them one final time, there was an explosion of light, brilliant and pure. The wraith's screams echoed through the church, its form disintegrating into nothingness. For a moment, all was silent. The church, the town, everything felt still. The weight of the curse had lifted. But Emma and Gabriel knew that the darkness would never be completely gone. It had been contained, but it would always linger, waiting for another moment of weakness. And until then, they would carry the burden of the curse. Together. It had been days since the ritual, and while the oppressive silence had returned to the town, it felt wrong. The kind of silence that was suffocating, as though it was holding its breath. Emma had hoped that with the destruction of the wraith, their nightmare would be over, but the sense of unease clung to her, like an invisible shroud. She found herself walking the empty streets at night, her mind racing with unanswered questions. What had truly happened during the ritual? How had the wraith been able to return after all the destruction they had caused? Was it really over? Gabriel had been quieter than usual, distant, his eyes hollow and filled with a kind of sorrow Emma couldn't quite place. It was like a part of him had been left behind in the church, something irrevocably lost. He had stopped speaking about the curse, about the ritual, as though the very mention of it pained him. Emma couldn't shake the feeling that something still watched them, something lingering in the shadows. It was as if the land itself had become haunted, its very soil soaked with the remnants of dark magic, and she could still hear the faint whispers sometimes in the corners of her mind, just enough to make her doubt her own sanity. One evening, she sat by the window in their small apartment, watching the moon rise. The town below seemed even quieter than usual. The wind had picked up, rustling the trees outside, and Emma found herself staring at the distant silhouette of the church. The ruins, once a symbol of evil, now stood like a decaying monument to something much darker than she had realized. Suddenly, her phone buzzed, breaking her thoughts. It was a message from Gabriel. "I need to show you something. Meet me at the church." Her heart skipped a beat. She had expected this. The doubt, the creeping suspicion that had followed them since the ritual. Something wasn't right. She stood up quickly, grabbing her jacket and heading out the door. The night air was cold, the streets unnaturally still as she made her way to the church. Every step felt like it echoed too loudly, like she was being drawn into something inevitable. The church loomed ahead, the darkened windows staring back at her like hollow eyes. It seemed alive in a way that no building should. The very air around it was thick with the same oppressive energy she had felt the night they had performed the ritual. As she approached the door, she saw Gabriel standing just inside the entrance, his silhouette barely visible in the dim light. His face was pale, his eyes bloodshot, and when he looked at her, Emma saw something in his gaze that froze her to the core. Fear. "Gabriel," she called softly, stepping inside. "What's going on?" He didn't respond immediately, his eyes darting around nervously, as if he were expecting something or someone to appear. He stepped closer to her, his voice barely a whisper. "Emma, I shouldn't have called you here, but I didn't know who else to turn to." "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. Gabriel took a deep breath, his hands shaking. "I've been having dreams, nightmares, about the Wraith, and about something else. Something worse. I didn't want to believe it, but I think I've figured it out." Emma felt a chill run down her spine. "What are you talking about?" "I think the Wraith was just a manifestation of something bigger. The curse, it didn't end. It evolved," Gabriel continued, his voice distant, as though he were trying to make sense of it all. "The land, the town, the church, they were all just a part of it. The Wraith was a tool, a servant. But what's truly behind it? I don't think we've even begun to understand." Emma's pulse quickened as his words sank in. "You're telling me that after everything, the curse didn't end? That it's still out there?" Gabriel nodded, his face grim. "It's not just out there, Emma. It's been with us, all along. The Wraith wasn't the cause, it was the effect. It was merely a warning." Emma felt her stomach twist as she took a step back. "What do we do?" "I've been researching," Gabriel said, pulling a weathered book from his jacket. It was the same book they had used for the ritual, its pages worn and frayed. He flipped it open, pointing to a passage she hadn't seen before. It described an ancient entity, an entity that could possess the land, the people, and even the very fabric of reality itself. It was a being that could adapt, that could change its form and shape to fit its needs, an entity tied to the land, to the very essence of the curse. "This is what we were dealing with," Gabriel whispered, "and it's still here." Before Emma could speak, the ground beneath them began to tremble once more, but this time it was different. It wasn't just a minor shake, it was violent, deep, the earth itself seeming to groan in pain. The church walls cracked as the floor split open, revealing a dark abyss beneath them. And from the depths, something emerged, something far worse than the Wraith. It was a shadow, a swirling mass of darkness, constantly shifting, constantly changing. It seemed to ripple and pulse like an infection, a sickness spreading through the very air. And as it began to take form, Emma saw that it was not just a creature. It was the curse itself, alive, breathing, and consuming everything in its path. Gabriel pulled Emma back, fear now evident in every line of his face. "We have to finish this, Emma. We have to destroy it before it consumes everything." But as they turned to run, the shadow reached out, tendrils of darkness wrapping around them, pulling them toward the abyss. The air grew colder, and the whispers, those same haunting voices, began to fill their minds once again. "You cannot escape. You cannot run from me." And then, Just as the world around them began to unravel, Emma heard a final whisper. It wasn't the voice of the wraith or the entity, but something else. Something that spoke directly to her. You were always meant to be mine. The shadows closed in, and Emma's last thought was that perhaps, in the end, there was no escaping the curse. The world seemed to disintegrate around Emma and Gabriel as the dark tendrils of the curse enveloped them. There was no escaping it, no place to run. The church had become a prison, its walls cracking and distorting under the weight of something ancient and far more terrifying than the wraith. The shadow was alive, and it was consuming everything in its path, warping reality itself. Emma could feel the coldness seeping into her skin, her body growing numb, the air thickening with the sense of something insidious taking hold. The whispers, the same voices from before, grew louder, swirling around her mind, making it impossible to distinguish one from the other. They were everywhere, in every corner, in every breath she took. She could hear her own name whispered in the darkness, a voice that seemed familiar, almost tender. Emma! The shadow was closer now, stretching toward them like an unholy web, tendrils snaking through the air and dragging them closer to the abyss. Gabriel had a grip on her arm, but his hands were shaking, his face pale with fear. His lips moved, but the words were lost in the cacophony of whispers. "Gabriel!" Emma screamed, but her voice was swallowed by the noise. The ground beneath them trembled violently as the darkness pressed in, suffocating them. She tried to push back, to fight, but there was nothing to fight, nothing to hold on to. The world around her seemed to vanish, the church, the land, the town, all swallowed up by the dark entity that had been waiting for this moment. Suddenly, there was a surge of light, a blinding, searing force that cut through the darkness. Emma gasped, blinking as the light filled her vision, forcing the shadows back, pushing them into the corners of the church. She could feel the energy in the air shift, like a pulse, a heartbeat. But the light didn't come from any source she could see. It wasn't the sun or any natural phenomenon. It was something else, something otherworldly. It filled her with both a sense of awe and dread, as though she were standing on the precipice of something vast and incomprehensible. The shadow recoiled from the light, its tendrils writhing in agitation, but it was still there, still watching, waiting. "You cannot escape me." The voice boomed in her mind, deeper now, as though it came from the very earth itself. The shadow was not just a creature. It was an embodiment of something much larger, a force that had existed long before the town, the church, and even the people themselves. It was the land. It was the curse. It was the will of something older than time itself. Gabriel's grip tightened on her arm, and for the first time, Emma saw something in his eyes that terrified her even more than the shadow. It was acceptance. "This is it," he said quietly, his voice barely audible over the sound of the whispers. "We can't fight it anymore." "No," Emma whispered, shaking her head. "We can't give up. There has to be another way." But Gabriel's expression was empty, resigned. "There's no other way. The curse was never meant to be broken, Emma. It was meant to bind us, to consume us." The light flickered once, then began to fade, as if it were being drawn into the very core of the shadow. The air grew heavier, the whispers louder. Emma's chest tightened with panic as she realized they were being dragged into the very essence of the curse, pulled into a darkness beyond comprehension. She struggled against Gabriel, pushing him away, her mind racing for any possible escape. And then, in a fleeting moment of clarity, she remembered something, a phrase from the book, a single line that had caught her attention during the ritual. A warning buried deep in the text. The curse cannot be broken, but it can be bound. It was a desperate thought, but it was the only one that made sense now. If the shadow was tied to the land, to the very soul of the place, Perhaps they didn't need to destroy it. Perhaps they could bind it, trap it once more. But how? Emma scanned the room, her eyes landing on the remnants of the altar, the symbols carved into the stone, the shattered remains of the ritual. It had been the right ritual, she was sure of it, but the binding spell had been incomplete. The book had warned her that the wraith was just a fragment of the curse, a servant, but the real power lay beneath. She looked at Gabriel again, her heart pounding in her chest. Gabriel, we need to complete the ritual. The full ritual. We have to bind it. Gabriel's eyes flickered with something, doubt, fear, maybe even hope. But before he could speak, the shadow lunged forward, its tendrils wrapping around them, pulling them toward the center of the church. The air around them crackled with the energy of the curse, and Emma's vision blurred as the darkness pressed against her. You cannot. The voice was so loud now, so all-consuming, that Emma thought her mind might shatter. But she pushed forward, her mind focused on the words she had read. She began to chant, the incantation rising from deep within her, her voice strong despite the terror clawing at her. The light flared again, brighter this time, as the power of the ritual surged through her, through Gabriel, through the very walls of the church. The shadow writhed and screamed, its form twisting and contorting, as if it were being torn apart by the light. The air grew colder, the whispers growing louder and more insistent, but Emma didn't falter. She couldn't. And then, with a deafening crash, the shadow shattered, dissipating into 1,000 wisp-like fragments that vanished into the ether. The church fell silent. The air, once thick with dark energy, was now still, heavy with the weight of finality. Emma collapsed to her knees, gasping for breath. Her body felt like it was made of stone, and her mind swam with the after-effects of the ritual. She looked at Gabriel, who stood beside her, his eyes wide with disbelief. I think we did it, she said breathlessly. Gabriel didn't respond right away. He just stood there, his face blank, staring at the empty space where the shadow had been moments before. The silence stretched between them, oppressive, as if something had changed, something they could no longer understand. For a long time, neither of them spoke. They didn't need to. The weight of what they had just done, the price they had paid, hung heavily in the air. The curse had been bound. The land, the town, the church, all of it had been freed. But Emma knew that the cost of their victory would haunt them forever. Some things could never truly be erased, and some curses, no matter how hard you tried, would always leave a scar. And she wondered, as they walked away from the church, if the land would ever truly be free, if the shadow would ever truly be gone. The cold night air felt heavier as Emma and Gabriel walked away from the church, the once imposing structure now a shell of its former self. The silence around them was eerie, too quiet for a world that had just experienced such a violent upheaval. The town that had once been suffocated by the curse now stood in an uncomfortable stillness, as though waiting to exhale. It was a strange, hollow kind of peace, and Emma couldn't shake the feeling that the land itself was holding its breath. With every step they took, Emma felt the weight of the ritual pressing down on her, the memory of the darkness they had just faced clinging to her like a second skin. The thought of the shadow, the curse, still lingered in her mind, its final scream echoing in her ears. It had been powerful, unstoppable, and yet they had managed to bind it, to hold it at bay. But had they truly destroyed it? Or had they merely delayed the inevitable? Emma glanced at Gabriel, his face pale and drawn. His eyes, once so full of determination, now looked hollow, as though the very essence of the curse had drained something from him, something that couldn't be restored. His hands trembled at his sides, and Emma could sense the weight of the guilt pressing down on him. "Gabriel," she said softly, her voice breaking the silence between them. "Are you okay?" He didn't answer immediately, his gaze fixed on the ground. When he finally looked up at her, his expression was one of quiet sorrow. "I should have told you," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "About the curse. About what we were really dealing with. I didn't want you to know. I didn't want you to get involved." Emma felt a pang of anger, but it was tempered by a deep sadness. "You should have trusted me, Gabriel. We're in this together. I thought I was protecting you," he replied, his voice thick with regret. "But I wasn't. I was just," he faltered, as if he couldn't find the words. They continued walking in silence, the weight of their shared experience settling over them like a shroud. The moon hung low in the sky, casting a dim light over the empty streets of the town. It felt like the calm after a storm, too still, too quiet. As they reached the edge of the town, Emma's eyes were drawn to the dark silhouette of the forest in the distance. The trees seemed to reach toward the sky like twisted fingers, their branches swaying in the wind. The forest had always been there, just beyond the town, a place of mystery and fear. But now, after everything they had been through, it felt different. It felt alive. Gabriel followed her gaze, his expression hardening as he saw where her attention was focused. "You feel it too, don't you?" he said, his voice low. Emma nodded, a chill running down her spine. She couldn't explain it, but something in the air had changed. It wasn't just the town that had been affected by the curse, it was the land itself. The trees, the soil, the very ground beneath their feet felt alive in a way that was wrong. The curse had been bound, but it hadn't been eradicated. It was still there, deep within the earth, waiting for the right moment to rise again. "Do you think it's over?" Emma asked, her voice barely a whisper. Gabriel's gaze darkened as he looked out at the forest. "I don't know," he replied quietly, "but I don't think it's done with us. It never really is." They stood there for a long moment, the silence between them growing more oppressive. Emma felt the weight of his words settle in her chest, and for the first time, she realized just how much they had truly lost. The curse might have been bound, but the land was still tainted. And so were they. A distant howl echoed through the forest, sending a shiver down Emma's spine. It was the sound of something primal, something ancient, and it chilled her to the bone. Her hand instinctively reached for Gabriel's, her fingers tightening around his, as if they could somehow hold onto each other and protect themselves from whatever was out there. "Let's go," she said, her voice shaky. "We need to get out of here." Gabriel didn't argue. He simply nodded, his hand tightening around hers as they turned to leave. But as they walked away from the town, Emma couldn't shake the feeling that something was following them. The wind carried a faint whisper, a murmur in the distance, too faint to understand but loud enough to make her heart race. "You can't run. You can't escape." The words were faint, but they were there, carried on the wind like a promise, a warning. Emma's pulse quickened, but she forced herself to keep walking, to keep moving forward. They couldn't stop now. They had to leave. They had to get away from this place before the darkness had a chance to rise again. But no matter how far they walked, Emma couldn't shake the feeling that the curse wasn't over, that it had merely retreated into the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike. As they made their way toward the edge of the town, Emma turned one last time to look at the church, its ruins bathed in the pale light of the moon. It seemed to watch them, its empty windows like hollow eyes, waiting for them to leave, waiting for the curse to return. And for the first time, Emma understood the truth. Some things could never be destroyed. Some curses were never meant to be broken. They were simply meant to endure. The world around them may have seemed calm, but the curse, whatever it was still there, lurking in the shadows, waiting. And one day, when the time was right, it would rise again. And when it did, Emma and Gabriel would have to face it all over again. But this time, would they survive? Or would they finally be consumed by the darkness? As Emma and Gabriel continued their journey away from the town, the darkness that had consumed them for so long seemed to cling to them like an unwanted shadow. Every step they took away from the town felt like a step closer to an unknown fate. The feeling of being pursued lingered, an overwhelming sensation of eyes watching from the forest behind them. Even as the road stretched out before them, they couldn't shake the sense that the curse, the shadow they had fought so hard to contain, was not far behind, waiting for an opportunity to strike again. It wasn't just the night that unsettled them, though the air had grown colder with each passing minute. It was the feeling of being on the edge of something they couldn't see but could sense, like a ticking clock winding down to a final, inevitable moment. Gabriel's silence grew heavier as they walked, the weight of his thoughts pressing against Emma's chest. His usually confident stride had slowed, his head down as if he were retreating inward. Emma wanted to speak to him, to ask what was going through his mind, but she wasn't sure if she could bear the answer. In the quiet, it felt as though their bond had been shattered in ways neither of them fully understood. He had been a part of this, his history, his bloodline tied to the curse, and yet now they were both survivors of something that was far from over. "Gabriel?" Emma called out softly, pulling herself from her thoughts. He didn't respond immediately, and she had to repeat herself before he turned to look at her, his face hard to read. "Are you okay?" she asked again. He gave a tight smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. "I'm fine. Just thinking." Emma felt a tight knot in her stomach, the uncertainty of their situation gnawing at her. The town behind them was silent now, but the woods ahead felt alive, as if the trees themselves were breathing, shifting in the dark. "The forest," she said suddenly, a realization dawning on her. "There's something wrong about it. It's like it's watching us." Gabriel's eyes flickered toward the dense, shadowy expanse ahead. The trees loomed dark and endless, the moonlight barely breaking through the thick canopy. It was unnerving, how still everything was, and yet how the forest seemed to pulse with life, its quiet rustling like a whisper carried on the wind. "It's not just the forest," Gabriel muttered. "It's the land, the curse. I think it's connected to the entire region, not just the town. We couldn't destroy it. We only bound it." The gravity of his words sank in, and Emma's chest tightened. They hadn't freed themselves from the curse. They had merely confined it, forcing it to retreat for the moment. But she couldn't allow herself to think that way, not yet. Not while there was still a chance to figure out how to end it once and for all. "We have to find a way to break the curse completely," Emma said, her voice steady, though the doubt in her heart threatened to overtake her. "We have to try." Gabriel stopped walking and turned to face her fully, the moonlight casting long shadows across his face. His eyes were dark and unreadable. "We've tried, Emma. We've done everything the book said, and it didn't work. I'm not sure there's anything left to break." "No," Emma replied firmly. "There has to be. We can't just give up now. We've come this far, Gabriel. We've faced things people can't even begin to imagine, and we're still standing. We're alive. We just need to figure out the rest." Gabriel looked at her for a long moment, his lips parted as though to speak, but no words came. Finally, he sighed deeply, running a hand through his disheveled hair. "You're right. I guess we have to keep going." They continued walking, but the unease of the forest grew. Emma could feel it now, an oppressive weight settling over her chest. The trees, as tall and ancient as they were, seemed to close in on them as they walked deeper into the woods. The wind howled through the branches, carrying with it a sense of something old, something far darker than anything they had faced in the town. It wasn't long before they came upon an old, decaying structure, an abandoned cabin nestled between the trees. The windows were shattered, the door hanging loosely on its hinges. The air around it was thick with an unnatural stillness. "This is strange," Emma whispered, her eyes narrowing. "I don't remember seeing this cabin before." Gabriel's eyes flickered over to the cabin, his brow furrowing as though something about it stirred an unfamiliar recognition. "I don't think we've been here before. But I feel like I've seen it in a dream." He paused, his face growing pale. A long time ago, Emma felt a chill run down her spine as she looked at him. There was something off about the cabin, something beyond just its dilapidated appearance. It beckoned them, drawing them closer despite their better judgment. They both knew it was a dangerous place to be, but curiosity, fear, and a strange sense of inevitability pushed them toward it. "What do you think is inside?" Emma asked, barely able to keep her voice steady. "I don't know, but whatever it is, it might have the answers we're looking for." They approached cautiously, Emma's heart hammering in her chest. The cabin groaned and creaked under the weight of the years, the boards bending and snapping as if the structure itself was alive, reacting to their presence. The door swung open with a creak, revealing nothing but dark shadows inside. But before Emma could make a decision to enter, a sudden gust of wind slammed the door shut behind them, trapping them inside. The air grew thick, suffocating them as the room seemed to pulse with energy. Emma's senses heightened, her pulse quickening as she realized they were not alone. From the corner of the room, something moved. Something that shouldn't be. A figure emerged from the shadows, tall and thin, with features too distorted to fully comprehend. It was humanoid in shape, but its movements were jerky, unnatural, as though it had been contorted by something unnatural. Who are you?" Emma whispered, her voice trembling as she took a step back. The figure didn't answer, but its eyes, if they could be called eyes, glowed with a faint, sickly yellow light. It tilted its head, its movements slow and deliberate, almost as though it were studying them. Emma felt the air grow colder, and the oppressive weight of the curse seemed to tighten its grip around her. And then the figure spoke. "We are bound by blood, by darkness. You cannot escape." The voice, if it could be called that, was not human. It was a cacophony of whispers, an echo of every nightmare Emma had ever had. It chilled her to the core. Gabriel stepped forward, his body rigid with tension. "What is this place?" he demanded. The figure's head jerked toward him. "You know what this is? It is where the curse began, and where it will end." The room seemed to shift, the walls closing in as the figure advanced toward them, its twisted form growing larger with each passing second. They were in the heart of the curse, and the end was coming for them. The figure moved closer, its movements unnatural, as though it was both crawling and floating in the same breath. Its glowing yellow eyes pierced the darkness, locking onto Emma and Gabriel with an intensity that made their skin crawl. The air grew thicker, colder, suffocating them as the cabin seemed to shift, the walls closing in with every beat of their hearts. What do you want?" Emma managed to choke out, her voice barely a whisper. Her throat tightened, and she struggled to maintain her composure in the face of this monstrous thing. The figure let out a soft, unsettling laugh, a sound that echoed in the cramped cabin and filled the space with a deep sense of dread. "We don't want anything," it said, its voice impossibly deep and yet layered with a chorus of otherworldly whispers. "We are bound by the same force that has claimed this land. We are the keepers of the curse, the witnesses of its birth." Gabriel took a step back, his face a mask of both fear and recognition. "The keepers," his voice trembled. "The old ones, the ones who were corrupted by the curse." The figure's head tilted to one side, its expression unreadable, yet somehow knowing. "The curse does not end," it said. "It only changes form. It feeds on the living, the ones who carry the blood of those who have witnessed the darkness. You, both of you, you are its children now." Emma's mind reeled. The blood, Gabriel's bloodline. She had heard rumors, whispers of the ancient family that had lived in the town for generations, connected to the land and the curse that had plagued it. But she never thought it could be true. That Gabriel, her friend, her companion, was tied to this nightmare. "You're lying," Emma said, though her voice faltered. "You're just trying to scare us." The figure's smile twisted. "Scared? No, we don't need to scare. We simply exist. And you, Emma, Gabriel, you cannot run from what you have already inherited." The cabin creaked again, louder now, and a strange pressure built in the air around them. Emma felt the room press in on her chest, as though the very walls were alive and suffocating her. "This is what we've been running from," she whispered, realization dawning. "The curse, it's always been here, hasn't it? Always waiting for the right moment to take us." Gabriel remained silent, his eyes wide as he took in the figure before them, the weight of his heritage dawning on him as well. But before he could speak, the figure raised a hand, long, gnarled fingers stretching out toward them. "Enough talk," it said coldly. "You have come too far. There is no more running." Before Emma could react, the air around them rippled, and the room seemed to shift violently. The walls of the cabin distorted, the floor trembling beneath their feet. The shadows in the room stretched, becoming alive, swirling with dark energy that surged toward them like a tidal wave. They stumbled backward, but the shadows were too fast. They wrapped around their legs, pulling them toward the figure, whose yellow eyes burned with an intensity that seemed to pierce straight through their souls. Gabriel reached out, grabbing Emma's arm. His grip was tight, but she could feel the tremble in his hands. "We have to get out of here," he shouted, panic creeping into his voice. The figure laughed again, the sound a low, guttural growl that reverberated through the cabin. "You cannot leave. You are bound to this place now, bound to the curse that resides within your blood." Emma's heart pounded in her chest, the overwhelming weight of the curse crushing down on them both. But in the midst of her fear, something inside her snapped. She wasn't going to let this thing, this monstrosity, win. Not now. Not after everything they had been through. "Gabriel," Emma shouted, her voice breaking through the panic. "We have to fight it." Gabriel looked at her, his expression torn. "How? We don't have the strength. We don't know how to fight it." But Emma's mind was racing, pulling on every bit of knowledge they had gained. The rituals, the binding spells, the ancient texts they had found hidden in the church. There had to be something they missed, something they could use to end this once and for all. She glanced at the figure, its eyes glowing brighter now, its form shifting like a mirage. "We need to use the binding," Emma said, her voice steady now, filled with determination. "The ritual we started, the one we did at the church. It wasn't just to bind it to the land, it was to seal it. We can finish what we started." Gabriel hesitated, but Emma could see the spark of hope in his eyes. "You're right. We can't let it have control. Not now." With every ounce of strength, Emma yanked her arm free from the shadows wrapping around her. She felt the coldness of them clawing at her, but she pushed forward. There was no turning back. "Not now. We need the salt," she said urgently. "The sacred salt we used in the church. We need to create a circle." Gabriel nodded quickly, reaching into his jacket pocket. "I have it. I always keep some with me now." The shadows around them hissed, recoiling as if sensing their intention. The figure's mouth twisted into an even darker smile, and it spoke with a voice like 1,000 whispers. "You think you can defeat me? You are nothing but mortals. You cannot even comprehend the true power of what you face." But Emma stood firm. She reached into her bag and pulled out the remnants of the ancient text they had found, the ritual they had half performed at the church. She could feel the weight of the words, the power hidden in each letter. This was the key. This was their only chance. Gabriel spread the salt on the floor, forming a circle. The figure watched them with growing fury, but it was too late. Emma began to chant the words from the text, the ancient language flowing from her lips like a long-forgotten memory. Gabriel joined her, his voice a steady rhythm alongside hers. The energy in the room shifted, the shadows recoiling, the air vibrating with the strength of their combined will. The figure screamed, a sound so horrifying that it made Emma's bones rattle, but they didn't stop. They couldn't stop. The cabin shook violently, the ground beneath them splitting open. The curse was fighting back, thrashing, writhing, but they held on. Finally, with one final, deafening scream, the figure disintegrated into smoke and dust, the darkness dissipating in a rush of wind that sent the cabin crumbling around them. Emma and Gabriel stood in the center of the ruined cabin, gasping for breath. The weight of the curse seemed to lift from the air, and the oppressive silence that had filled the room faded away. But even in their victory, Emma couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end. The curse had been sealed for now, but something still lingered, something that wasn't quite finished. She glanced at Gabriel, whose face was pale and drawn. He met her eyes, and for the first time since the nightmare began, he seemed truly afraid. "Is it over?" he whispered. Emma shook her head. "No, but we've bought ourselves some time." Emma's words hung in the air, heavy with uncertainty. The moment they had just experienced, the destruction of the figure, the dispelling of the curse, had been intense, but it didn't feel like a victory. It felt like a reprieve, a momentary pause in an ongoing battle. The eerie silence that had followed the figure's disintegration was deafening, and despite the absence of the creature, the air felt thick, charged with something else. Something that Emma couldn't quite name, but it left her uneasy. She turned to Gabriel, who was still kneeling in the circle of salt, his hands trembling slightly. His usually stoic demeanor was gone, replaced by an expression of exhaustion and a deep, palpable fear. Emma knew that he was struggling with the same thought that gnawed at her. This was far from over. "We need to keep moving," she said finally, breaking the silence. Her voice was firm, but it barely concealed the tremor in her chest. Gabriel looked up at her, his eyes wide and searching. He seemed lost, as if he couldn't quite grasp the enormity of what they had just done. "Where do we go? What do we do next?" Emma hesitated. Her first instinct was to leave, to escape this cursed place entirely. But the truth was, they didn't know where they were going. They didn't know what the next step was. They had destroyed the figure, but it was clear now that there was much more to this curse than they had realized. The cabin had been only a small part of a much larger, darker web, and wherever they went next, the curse would follow. "We have to go to the source," Emma said, her voice quiet but resolute. "The land, the town, whatever it is that keeps the curse alive, we have to find it and destroy it." Gabriel nodded slowly, the weight of her words sinking in. He stood up, wiping dust and dirt from his clothes, though there was no real cleanliness to be had. His face was drawn, and the exhaustion of the night seemed to settle deeper into his bones. "How do we find the source?" he asked, his voice strained. Emma didn't have an answer for that. They had followed the breadcrumbs so far, old texts, forgotten rituals, cryptic warnings. But there was no clear path forward. She didn't know where the heart of the curse was, or how to stop it for good. "There's a place," Gabriel said suddenly, his voice low and uncertain. "I've heard of it, an old shrine deep in the woods. It's tied to the curse, to everything." Emma raised an eyebrow. "A shrine?" Gabriel nodded, his face tight with reluctance. "It's an old place, abandoned and hidden away. My family, we used to know about it, but I never went there. I didn't want to. I was told it was a place of dark power." Emma's pulse quickened. "Do you think it's the source of the curse?" Gabriel didn't answer immediately. His eyes darted to the cabin's crumbling walls, and for a moment, Emma could see the fear he was trying to suppress. It might be. I don't know. But I don't think we can break the curse without facing it. The decision was made then, not in words, but in the shared silence between them. They had no choice. They had to go to the shrine. The walk to the shrine was long and treacherous, and the air felt heavier with each passing mile. The trees around them seemed to close in, the branches hanging low like skeletal hands reaching toward them. The further they ventured, the more the world around them seemed to warp, as though the land itself was shifting and watching, its gaze never leaving them. The silence in the woods was unnerving. There were no sounds of animals, no birds singing, no rustling of leaves in the breeze. It was as if the natural world itself had gone still, holding its breath in anticipation of something yet to come. As they made their way deeper into the forest, Emma's thoughts turned darker. The feeling of being watched never left her. She could feel eyes on her from all directions, hidden in the trees, in the shadows. She glanced over at Gabriel, who was walking beside her, his face pale and drawn, his eyes scanning the path ahead with nervous intensity. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice soft, though she couldn't entirely mask the concern in it. Gabriel's lips parted as though to speak, but he closed his mouth again, as if the words were stuck somewhere deep inside him. He shook his head. "I don't know if I can do this, Emma. It feels like we're walking into something we can't control, something we'll never be able to get out of." Emma reached out and placed a hand on his arm. "We've come this far. We can't stop now. We have to face this, together." Gabriel's eyes flickered to hers, and for a moment he seemed to draw strength from her words. His shoulders squared, and he nodded, though the uncertainty still lingered in his gaze. They pressed on, walking in tense silence as the woods grew darker, the path narrowing and winding like a labyrinth. It felt as though the trees themselves were closing in around them, trapping them in a maze of shadows. Finally, they came upon a clearing, and in the center of it stood a structure, a stone altar, weathered and cracked with age. The air around it felt dense, thick with a strange, suffocating energy. The altar was surrounded by a ring of old, gnarled trees, their twisted branches reaching toward the sky as though trying to claw their way out of the earth. Emma felt a chill run through her as she looked at it. The sight of the altar made her blood run cold, and a deep sense of dread settled in her stomach. This was it, the heart of the curse. Gabriel took a hesitant step forward, his eyes never leaving the altar. "This is it," he whispered. "The shrine. The source." Emma followed, though every instinct in her screamed to turn back. They had to do this. They had no choice. But deep down, a part of her wondered if they were walking into their doom. She stopped beside him, her hand trembling as she reached for the altar. It was cold to the touch, its surface slick with something that felt like a mixture of sweat and blood. There were strange symbols carved into the stone, symbols she didn't recognize, though they seemed oddly familiar, as though she had seen them in a dream. Gabriel's voice broke through her thoughts. "We have to break the seal," he said. "The curse is bound here. If we can destroy it, the land will be free." Emma nodded, though doubt gnawed at her. She turned her attention to the symbols again. They seemed to pulse, faintly glowing in the dim light. "We'll need to use the ritual again," Emma said. "But this time we have to finish it. We can't hold back." Gabriel's lips pressed into a thin line. "Are we ready for this?" "We have no choice," Emma whispered, taking a deep breath. "It's now or never." The words of the ritual began to form on her lips, and the air around them seemed to hum with anticipation. Emma closed her eyes, grounding herself in the present, trying to ignore the deep unease that gnawed at her. She knew that what she was about to do wasn't just a ritual. It was the culmination of everything they had encountered, everything they had fought against. And whatever was tied to this cursed land, whatever evil had taken root in this place, they would need all their strength to face it. She took a step forward, feeling Gabriel's presence beside her. The energy in the air was palpable now, pressing in on them, as if the very land itself was waiting to see what would happen next. There was no turning back. This had to end one way or another. Emma's voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried in the tense silence of the clearing. We must finish what was started. The words of the ritual came to her more naturally now, the ancient language flowing through her lips with a strength she hadn't known she possessed. She could feel the weight of each syllable as if they were carving into her soul. As she spoke, the air around her seemed to vibrate, a tremor of power rippling through the trees, sending a shiver through her spine. Gabriel stood beside her, hands clenched into fists at his sides, his gaze fixed on the altar. He could feel it too, the oppressive presence in the air, the pull of something dark and ancient tugging at his very core. But he stood firm, drawing strength from Emma as she continued the chant, her voice growing stronger with each passing moment. A cold wind began to swirl around them, twisting through the trees, its howl rising in intensity. The trees groaned as if responding to the power that was being unleashed. Emma's heart raced, her pulse quickening with every word she spoke. The power was growing, and she could feel the land itself resisting it. The curse was fighting back. Then, with a violent rush, the ground beneath them trembled. The altar began to glow, the symbols etched into its surface illuminating with an eerie greenish light. It was as if the very stone was coming to life, pulsing with an energy that made Emma's skin crawl. Gabriel reached out, gripping Emma's arm. His face was pale, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "We can't stop now," he said, his voice strained. "It's fighting us." "I know," Emma replied, gritting her teeth. "But we have to finish it. We have no choice." The wind picked up, howling louder now, as though something was rising from the depths of the earth. Emma's words quickened, and the air grew colder still. Her breath came out in visible puffs, her body shaking with the sheer power of the ritual. The land was responding, fighting, struggling against the weight of the curse. And then, just as the tension seemed unbearable, the ground beneath their feet cracked open. The earth split, sending a shockwave through the clearing, and the altar shuddered violently. Emma stumbled, but Gabriel steadied her, his grip tight on her arm. Something was rising from the earth, something dark and ancient, and it was angry. The air was filled with a low, guttural growl, like the roar of a beast that had been awakened after a long slumber. The shadows around them deepened, coiling like snakes in the air, growing darker, more tangible. Emma's heart thudded in her chest, her instincts screaming at her to run. But there was no running now. They had come too far. From the crack in the earth, a shape began to emerge. It was massive, a swirling mass of darkness and shadows, its form constantly shifting, as if it was made of the very night itself. The creature's eyes gleamed with an unnatural, malevolent glow, the same yellow eyes they had seen before in the figure at the cabin. Gabriel's breath caught in his throat. "That's it," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "That's what we've been running from." The creature let out a terrible roar, shaking the ground beneath them, and the very air seemed to warp around it. The curse was alive, and it had taken form. Emma stumbled back, her legs trembling beneath her. She had to finish the ritual, had to stop it now, before the creature broke free entirely. She gripped the ancient text in her hands, her fingers digging into the fragile pages as she spoke the final words. But the creature wasn't finished yet. It surged forward, its form rippling like smoke, faster than anything Emma or Gabriel could react to. The shadows stretched, consuming everything in their path, wrapping around Emma's legs, dragging her toward the altar. "No," she screamed, struggling against the shadows, but they only tightened their grip, pulling her toward the center of the ritual. The dark energy was overwhelming now, choking the air out of her lungs. Gabriel reached for her, but the shadows pulled him back, trapping him in their grip as well. "Emma!" he shouted, his voice filled with panic. The creature's laugh echoed in the clearing, deep and menacing. "You think you can stop me?" it hissed, its voice like the wind howling through the trees. "You are nothing but puppets, bound to this land, bound to me." Emma's heart raced as she fought against the pull of the shadows, the creature's influence crawling into her mind. She could feel it, the dark power seeping into her thoughts, trying to control her, to bend her will to its own. But she couldn't give in. Not now. Not after everything. With every ounce of strength, Emma pulled herself forward, breaking free from the shadow's grip. She turned to face the altar once more, the last words of the ritual burning on her tongue. She knew now what she had to do. "Gabriel," she shouted, "we have to bind it." Gabriel's eyes locked with hers, and for the briefest moment, they both understood. They knew what had to be done. They had to finish the ritual, had to bind the creature to the altar before it was too late. Together, they recited the final words, the ancient language rolling from their tongues like a wave crashing against the shore. The ground shook violently as the ritual reached its climax, the creature's form distorting in agony, its dark energy pulsing with fury. The earth cracked once more, but this time, the cracks didn't open to unleash more darkness. Instead, the creature's form began to retract, the shadows pulling back like a receding tide. The yellow eyes dimmed, fading into nothingness. Emma's body shook with exhaustion, but she didn't stop. They were so close to ending this nightmare once and for all. She pushed through the pain, speaking the final syllables of the ritual with all the strength she had left. And then, with one final deafening roar, the creature vanished. The land fell silent. The air cleared. For a moment, Emma thought it was over. The curse had been sealed away. But as the dust settled and the shadows retreated, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was still lurking beneath the surface. Something that wasn't quite finished. The ritual was complete, but the land had been marked forever. The curse had been bound, but it had not been destroyed. And Emma knew deep down that no matter what they had done, no matter how many times they tried to fight it, the darkness would always be waiting. The clearing remained eerily still, the oppressive weight of the creature's presence finally dissipating into the air, though the unsettling sensation lingered. Emma stood there, her body trembling, as if the fear and exhaustion had sunk into her very bones. Gabriel was beside her, his face pale, eyes wide, as if he couldn't fully comprehend what they had just faced. "Is it really over?" Gabriel whispered, his voice hoarse, strained from the ritual. He couldn't stop looking around, his eyes darting from shadow to shadow, as if expecting something to leap out at them from the darkness. Emma didn't know how to answer. She didn't know if the curse had been fully broken, or if what they had done was merely a temporary measure to contain the darkness that had plagued this place for so long. The ground beneath them still felt wrong, as though the earth had been tainted, as if some part of the curse had seeped into it, leaving a permanent stain. "I don't know," Emma admitted, her voice shaky. "It feels like we've only just scratched the surface. Like something is still out there, waiting." Gabriel's grip on her arm tightened, his fingers cold against her skin. "Then we can't stay here. We have to leave, Emma. We have to get away from this place." Emma nodded, her heart heavy with uncertainty. The night was far from over, and though the immediate threat had receded, the aftermath of the curse was still a terrifying unknown. But Gabriel was right. Staying here wasn't an option. Not with the land still feeling like it was holding its breath, waiting for the moment when it could unleash something worse. "We can't go back to the cabin," Emma said, her thoughts already racing. "We have to get to the town. We need help. We need to figure out what we're dealing with, once and for all." Gabriel nodded, though it was clear he didn't want to be anywhere near the cursed land. "Let's go. Whatever's waiting here. I don't want to face it alone." They turned, their steps slow and cautious, as they made their way back through the dark woods. The trees seemed to close in around them, their twisted branches creaking in the wind. The silence was deafening, broken only by the crunch of their footsteps on the underbrush. It felt like the world was holding its breath, and with each step, Emma couldn't shake the feeling that they were being followed, watched from the shadows. The walk back to the town was long, every minute stretching into what felt like an eternity. The sense of unease only grew stronger as they moved further from the shrine, and Emma couldn't help but glance over her shoulder every now and then, half expecting to see the creature or some other dark figure emerging from the woods behind them. But nothing came. By the time they reached the outskirts of the town, the first light of dawn was breaking over the horizon, casting pale rays across the landscape. The town, normally quiet and sleepy, felt unnervingly still. There were no signs of life, no movement in the streets. It was as if the entire town was holding its breath too. Emma and Gabriel approached the small, run-down motel they had passed earlier, the one they had hoped would offer some sort of refuge. The door creaked as they pushed it open, the stale air inside offering little comfort. They stepped in, locking the door behind them. It wasn't much, a bed, a few chairs, a broken lamp in the corner, but it was a place to rest. And for now, that was all they needed. Emma sank onto the bed, her legs giving out beneath her. Gabriel stood near the window, his eyes scanning the streets below. "We need to figure out what happens next," he said quietly, his voice distant. "That thing we faced, it was just a piece of the curse, wasn't it?" Emma nodded, her thoughts racing. "I think so. There's more to it. This place, the land, it's all connected somehow. We were right to come here, but we don't know what else we're up against." Gabriel turned to face her. "So what now? What do we do?" Emma took a deep breath, trying to collect her thoughts. "We need to find out everything we can about the history of this place. We need to learn about the curse, its origins. If there's anything, any way, to destroy it once and for all, we have to know what we're dealing with." She stood up, her body still trembling, though she was determined to keep going. "We need to find someone who knows. Someone who can help us." But even as she said the words, something deep within her made her doubt the possibility of finding answers so easily. The curse had been buried for generations, and the land itself seemed to resent any attempt to uncover its secrets. Gabriel's gaze was heavy as he turned toward the door. "Do you think anyone in this town knows what's really going on? Or are they all too scared to speak?" Emma paused. "I don't know. But we can't be the only ones who've noticed the strange things happening here. Someone must know." It was then that the thought occurred to her. The man who gave us the warning. The old man at the edge of town. The one who had spoken in riddles and spoken of ancient things. Maybe he held the answers they needed. Maybe he had seen what they had seen, lived through what they were facing. If anyone could help them, it might be him. "We'll go see him," Emma said, more to herself than to Gabriel. "Tomorrow, first thing. He might know something about the curse, something we missed." Gabriel hesitated, clearly uneasy. "Are you sure?" He seemed untrustworthy. Emma nodded firmly. "We don't have many options, Gabriel. We need every lead we can find." As the night wore on, they stayed in the motel, too exhausted to go anywhere else. But sleep didn't come easily. Emma kept hearing whispers, soft, almost imperceptible sounds, like the rustling of leaves or the faintest scrape of nails against the window. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw those yellow eyes again, glowing in the dark, watching her. When dawn finally broke, they set out for the old man's house, determined to get the answers they so desperately needed. But as they made their way through the quiet streets, the sense of foreboding grew, thickening around them like a fog. The town was different now, as if it too had become part of the curse. The houses looked abandoned, their windows dark and empty. The roads were eerily silent, as if the town itself had been frozen in time. And then, just as they reached the old man's house, the door creaked open, but no one was there. The mystery deepened. Emma and Gabriel exchanged a glance, both of them instinctively taking a step back. The door had opened on its own, the faint creak of the old wood sounding louder in the stillness of the town. The house in front of them seemed even more decayed now, its windows clouded with dirt, the once white paint peeling away in strips. It was as if the house had been abandoned for years, yet the door, strangely ajar, hinted that someone or something was still inside. "Maybe it's just the wind," Gabriel muttered, his voice tinged with doubt. But even as he spoke, his feet moved reluctantly toward the threshold. "No," Emma whispered, shaking her head. "It doesn't feel right." Despite the sinking feeling in her gut, Emma pushed forward, determined to see this through. They had come too far to turn back now. If there were answers to be found, they would be in that house. Answers that could either lead them to the truth or pull them deeper into whatever dark web had been spun around this cursed town. The air inside the house was heavy, thick with dust and the unmistakable scent of decay. The dim light filtering through the grimy windows cast everything in shadow, adding to the oppressive atmosphere. The floorboards creaked beneath their feet as they stepped cautiously through the front room, the silence almost unbearable. "Hello," Emma called out, her voice trembling slightly despite her resolve. "Is anyone here?" No answer came, only the haunting echo of her own voice. They moved through the house, room by room, their footsteps the only sound breaking the quiet. The furniture, once grand and ornate, was now covered in sheets, their edges tattered and worn. The walls were adorned with faded photographs, families, smiling and unaware of the horrors that would eventually stain the town. Emma couldn't help but notice the way their eyes seemed to follow her, a cold, unsettling gaze that never seemed to leave her. They reached the back of the house, where a narrow staircase led down into a dark, musty basement. A cold draft of air seeped from below, carrying with it the faint scent of something rancid. Emma paused, staring at the stairs. Something about the basement felt wrong. "We need to go down there," she said, her voice steady despite the shiver that ran down her spine. The old man must have left something behind. A clue, maybe. Something to explain all of this. Gabriel didn't respond immediately. He was staring at the stairs, his brow furrowed in suspicion. But after a moment of hesitation, he nodded. "All right, but we need to be careful. If this place is connected to the curse, who knows what we might find down there." Together, they descended into the basement, the air growing colder with each step. The staircase creaked ominously under their weight, and Emma could feel her heart beating faster, each thump reverberating in the silence of the house. The faint light from above barely illuminated the room below, leaving most of the basement cloaked in darkness. But as they reached the bottom, Emma saw something that made her blood run cold. The walls of the basement were lined with strange markings, symbols carved into the stone, glowing faintly in the dark. Some of the symbols Emma recognized from the ritual, but there were others, foreign and unrecognizable. They seemed to writhe and shift before her eyes, as though alive, reacting to her presence. "What is this?" Gabriel whispered, his voice filled with awe and dread. Emma didn't answer right away. She was too busy taking in the horrifying sight before her. The basement was not just a place of storage, it was a shrine. In the center of the room stood an altar, covered in dark, dried stains. The altar was made of stone, but it was far older than anything she had seen in the town. Ancient runes were etched into its surface, and around it, dozens of empty candles, their wicks long burnt out, were arranged in a circle. She approached cautiously, but as she did, she felt the unmistakable weight of eyes upon her. She turned, only to see a figure standing in the far corner of the room, obscured by shadow. The figure didn't move, didn't speak, just watched. The air around them seemed to grow heavier, and Emma could feel the temperature drop even further. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice more urgent now. There was no response, but the figure shifted slightly, as though acknowledging her presence. Emma's heart raced. She couldn't see the face, but she could feel the presence of something ancient, something powerful. Suddenly, Gabriel stepped forward, his voice loud in the otherwise oppressive silence. "Show yourself." At his words, the figure slowly moved forward into the dim light. It was an old man, his face haggard and pale, his eyes sunken and wild. His clothes were ragged, as though he hadn't changed them in years. He was muttering something under his breath, something incomprehensible, his hands shaking as if gripped by some unseen force. Emma's heart skipped a beat. You're the one who warned us." The old man's eyes locked onto hers, and for a moment, the room seemed to hold its breath. "You shouldn't have come," he rasped, his voice hoarse and cracked. "You should have stayed away. The curse, it's not just the land. It's the blood." The words sent a chill down Emma's spine. "The blood," she repeated, struggling to understand. The old man nodded slowly, his eyes filled with a mix of fear and regret. "The curse runs deep, deeper than you know. It's tied to the very foundation of this place. The land was built on blood, blood that was spilled, blood that never stopped flowing." Emma took a step toward him. "What do you mean? What happened here?" The old man took a shaky breath, his eyes darting toward the altar. "It's a pact, a blood pact, made long ago. They summoned something terrible." His voice faltered, and it was never meant to be broken. "But the curse, it calls for a price." Emma's mind raced as she tried to piece together the fragments of information. The blood, the pact, the altar. They had only scratched the surface, but it was clear that the curse was far more ancient and twisted than they had imagined. It wasn't just a random evil. It was a force tied to the land, to the very blood that had been spilled here. And as the old man's words hung heavy in the air, Emma realized with a sinking heart that the true terror of Blackwood Manor had only just begun to reveal itself. The old man's eyes were wild, his breath shallow, as if speaking the truth was tearing him apart. His hands trembled, clasped tightly together as though fighting against something far more powerful than he could control. His gaze never left Emma, and the oppressive weight of his words filled the air like a suffocating cloud. "The pact, the blood," he murmured again, his voice barely audible. "It was meant to ensure that the curse would never be broken. The price, it was always meant to be paid." Emma stepped forward cautiously, feeling the coldness of the basement closing in around them. Gabriel, though silent, seemed to tense beside her, his instincts alert, his eyes darting around, searching for something, anything, that might offer them a clue as to how they could escape this nightmare. "What price?" Emma asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Her throat was tight, and the air felt heavy in her lungs as she pressed for more. "What do you mean, the price?" The old man's mouth twitched into a grimace. "The price is the bloodline that binds the curse to this place. The one who is tied to the blood must pay it. But there are others who can help carry the weight, if they are willing." Emma's heart raced as his words sank in. She had a horrible feeling that she was part of something much larger than herself. something that had been waiting for the right time to reveal its true horror. Her hand instinctively moved to her chest, where the necklace, the one she had inherited, still hung heavy around her neck. It felt warmer now, almost too warm, as though it was reacting to the mention of blood. The old man caught the movement, his eyes flicking to the necklace, and a shudder ran through his frail body. His voice dropped to a near whisper. "You're the one. You carry the bloodline. You're the key." Gabriel took a step back, his face pale as the realization began to set in. No, that's not possible. She's just an ordinary college student. She didn't ask for any of this. But the old man only nodded, his face a picture of sorrow. "You can deny it all you want, but it's in your blood, girl. The curse recognizes it. It will stop at nothing to claim it." Emma felt a cold sweat break out across her skin, her mind racing to understand what the old man was saying. The bloodline. She wasn't just here by accident. She wasn't just a random student caught up in the supernatural forces of Blackwood Manor. Somehow, her very existence had been tied to the land, to the curse from the moment she was born. How? How do I stop it?" Emma asked, her voice trembling despite her best efforts to sound strong. The old man shook his head slowly, his expression mournful. "I don't know. The curse has grown stronger with time. There was once a way, an ancient ritual, but it has been lost. Lost to time, lost to memory. What remains now is the hunger, the endless craving for the bloodline to be consumed." The room seemed to grow darker as he spoke, and Emma's heart sank deeper with each passing moment. This wasn't just a curse. This was an eternal hunger, a force that could never be sated, no matter how much blood it claimed. She wasn't just running from a curse. She was running from the very thing that had been built into the blood of her ancestors. I can't do this," Emma whispered, backing away from the altar, her legs trembling. This isn't me. I don't want this. I didn't ask for this." The old man's eyes softened, pity in their depths. "You don't have a choice. The curse has already claimed you, whether you want it or not. You will either become its next victim, or you will find a way to break it. But that path is fraught with danger. Every step you take will be watched. It will not let you go." Emma shook her head in disbelief. "But I don't even know what I'm supposed to do. What am I supposed to fight?" He opened his mouth to respond, but suddenly the house seemed to groan, the floor shaking beneath their feet. The lights flickered, and an unnatural chill swept through the basement. Emma felt a cold hand grip her heart, a terror so raw and visceral that it nearly took her breath away. The old man's face paled, his expression shifting from sorrow to fear. He gripped the side of the altar for support, his eyes wide in panic. "It's here," he breathed, his voice cracking. "It's not just a curse. It's alive, and it's been waiting." Before Emma could ask him what he meant, the shadows in the corners of the basement seemed to stretch and writhe, moving like living things. The air grew heavy, oppressive, thick with something ancient and malevolent. It wasn't just the curse she had to worry about anymore. The very house, the land, was alive with something dark and hungry, and it had now found them. Emma's mind raced, her pulse pounding in her ears. "Gabriel, we have to get out of here," she shouted, grabbing his arm. Gabriel didn't need to be told twice. They turned and ran toward the stairs, but as they reached the bottom of the staircase, a sudden scream echoed through the house, a high-pitched, spine-chilling wail that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Emma stumbled, almost losing her footing. The sound filled the air, reverberating in their ears, making her blood run cold. "Move," she cried, pulling Gabriel along as they scrambled up the stairs, the entire house seeming to shake with each step they took. The wail was followed by a deep, guttural growl, something far worse than anything they had encountered before. They reached the front door, but it slammed shut just as they reached it. A force, invisible but suffocating, held them in place. "Let us out!" Emma screamed, pounding on the door, but it didn't budge. The growl grew louder, the air thick with a malevolent presence that pressed down on them like a physical weight. The old man's voice echoed from behind them, his words ragged with fear. "The curse, it has awakened. You are no longer safe." It was then that Emma realized with a chilling certainty that their fight had only just begun. Whatever entity had been bound by the bloodline, by the pact, whatever horror had been unleashed, it wasn't done with them yet. The walls of the house seemed to constrict, the very air turning heavy with an ancient, malevolent force that pressed in from all sides. Emma's heart pounded in her chest, every instinct screaming at her to run, to escape, but the door wouldn't budge. The oppressive weight of the curse, of the entity now hunting them, was suffocating, choking off any hope of survival. Gabriel grabbed her arm, his grip tight with panic. "We need to find another way out." His voice was sharp, strained with fear. Emma turned toward him, her breath shallow and erratic. The darkness of the house seemed to stretch farther than before, shadows in every corner, swirling and shifting. The floor creaked ominously under their feet, as though the house itself was alive and watching. The growl from below, the low, guttural sound that rumbled through the house, was closer now, and its terrifying presence filled the air, reverberating in Emma's very bones. "The windows," she gasped, pointing toward the large, grimy windows in the entryway. The light from outside filtered through the foggy glass, but it was dim, clouded by the layers of dirt and grime. "We can't break them," Gabriel said quickly, his eyes wide with terror. It'll just no." "No time," Emma snapped, pulling him toward the windows. She could feel the air growing colder with each passing second. She needed to act, needed to do something, anything, to escape the growing malevolent force that was closing in on them. They reached the window and Emma grabbed the nearest object, a vase that had once been part of a collection on a nearby table, and hurled it against the glass. It shattered with a loud crash, sending jagged shards flying in all directions. The window was broken, but the sound of shattering glass only seemed to increase the intensity of the growl below, the house seeming to shake beneath them in response. "Go! Now!" Emma shouted, forcing her body through the gap in the window. Gabriel hesitated for a split second, then followed, but as he pulled himself through, something caught his ankle, a cold, skeletal hand reaching from the shadows below, grabbing him with an unrelenting grip. "Help!" Gabriel cried out, his voice filled with panic as he struggled against the icy, unyielding hand. Emma didn't think. She reached down, grabbing Gabriel's hand and pulling with every ounce of strength she had, but the hand wouldn't release him. It tightened around his ankle, pulling him back toward the darkened basement. "Let go!" Emma screamed, desperate. She pulled harder, her nails digging into his wrist, but it felt like there was no strength left in the world that could stop the entity from dragging him back into the depths. Gabriel's face was pale, his eyes wide with terror as the grip tightened. His foot jerked backward, his body nearly pulled back through the window, and then, with a final wrenching pull, the hand let go. He was free, but at a cost. The window was now wide open, but the presence of the entity was too close. The growl had intensified to a roar, an angry, primal noise that filled the house, vibrating the very walls around them. Something was coming, and it was coming fast. "We need to go now," Emma shouted, her voice breaking with urgency. She pulled Gabriel to his feet, dragging him away from the window as fast as she could. As they stumbled toward the front door, the house seemed to close in around them, every creak of the floorboards like the heavy footfalls of something chasing them. The growl had turned into a series of shrieks, high-pitched and frantic, as if whatever lay below was calling out for them. Emma glanced over her shoulder and saw a shadow, dark, shifting, and utterly formless, rising from the depths of the basement. It seemed to flicker, just out of focus, as if it were something not entirely of this world, something that defied every natural law she knew. "Emma, this way!" Gabriel shouted, pulling her toward the side door. It was a small, hidden exit, the kind that had probably been used for deliveries or servants in the house's prime, but it was their only chance now. They reached it, Emma nearly falling as she scrambled to pull open the creaky door. It didn't budge at first, but after several panicked yanks, it gave way with a loud groan. They spilled out into the night air, the cold wind hitting them with a rush of relief, but that relief was short-lived. The shrieking from inside the house had stopped, replaced with a low, guttural growl that seemed to rise from the earth itself. Emma looked back just in time to see the door slam shut with violent force. The entire house shuddered, as though the curse was reaching out to them, trying to drag them back. "What the hell is that thing?" Gabriel gasped, his face pale as he took in the house behind them. "I don't know," Emma said, her voice shaking. "But whatever it is, it's not human. It's something old, something ancient, and it's not going to stop until it gets what it wants." They ran across the yard, through the overgrown grass, and toward the edge of the property, but the ground beneath their feet seemed to tremble. The trees swayed unnaturally, their branches moving as though pushed by an unseen wind. The air felt thick with the oppressive presence of the entity, and the shadows seemed to stretch out toward them, hungry for their blood. "I think we're being followed," Gabriel said, his voice tight with fear. He looked over his shoulder, but there was nothing behind them except the looming silhouette of Blackwood Manor, dark and foreboding in the night. Emma didn't respond. She had the same gut-wrenching feeling. The entity was out there, somewhere, waiting for them to make a mistake. "Where do we go?" Gabriel asked, panic rising in his voice. "There's a place," Emma said, her mind racing. She remembered the map they had found earlier, the one that marked the cemetery near the edge of town. It was an old, abandoned cemetery, far from the town's center. The map had shown an odd, unmarked path that led into the woods. She didn't know what it led to, but in her gut, Emma felt that it was their only chance. "The cemetery. We have to get there." Gabriel nodded, and without another word, they took off, heading for the woods. The curse wasn't done with them, not by a long shot. The night air was thick with the scent of damp earth as Emma and Gabriel plunged into the dense woods, the sounds of their hurried footsteps the only thing breaking the otherwise oppressive silence. The path, though faint, twisted through the trees like a long-forgotten trail, overgrown with wild vines and brambles that clawed at their clothes and skin. Behind them, the looming presence of Blackwood Manor still felt close, as if the very land beneath their feet was tethered to the house by invisible threads, pulling them back. Emma's breath came in ragged gasps, her chest tight with fear. She could still hear the growl in the distance, deep and guttural, as if it were chasing them, relentless and insatiable. "We're not going to make it, Emma," Gabriel panted, his voice shaking with dread. He stumbled slightly, his legs heavy with exhaustion. "Whatever that thing is, it's too close. It's not going to stop," Emma said through clenched teeth, her hand gripping Gabriel's arm tightly. Her pulse raced, every step taking them further away from the nightmare of Blackwood Manor. But she couldn't shake the feeling that the entity was still lurking in the darkness, just behind them, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. "The cemetery," she repeated, as if saying the words aloud would somehow make it real. The map had led them here, through the woods, to this forgotten corner of the land. Her instincts told her it wasn't just a place of burial. It felt different, ancient, as though something far older than the house itself was buried there. We have to reach the cemetery. We don't have a choice. Gabriel didn't answer, but Emma could hear the panic in his breathing. He was terrified, as she was. Every instinct screamed that they needed to run, but there was no safe place to run to. The curse had already marked them. The shadow was closing in. Minutes passed, and the woods around them grew darker. The twisted trees seemed to close in on them, blocking out what little light remained from the distant moon. The path was narrowing, twisting, and soon it felt like they were walking through a maze of suffocating shadows. The growl, once distant, now reverberated through the trees, sending tremors down Emma's spine. It was no longer just a sound. It was a presence, something that was hunting them. "Emma!" Gabriel whispered harshly, his voice laced with panic. He stopped in his tracks, his body rigid with fear. Emma turned to see him staring at the woods around them, his face pale and eyes wide with terror. "What?" she asked, trying to calm herself as she followed his gaze. "Look!" His voice trembled as he pointed to the shadows ahead of them. For a moment, everything seemed still, too still, and then she saw it. Movement, dark and swift, like something flickering in and out of existence, just at the edge of her vision. It was more than just the shadows. The shape was humanoid, but somehow wrong, unnatural. "Run!" Emma screamed, grabbing his arm once more and pulling him forward. Her heart raced as she tried to force herself to move faster, the shape growing closer in their peripheral vision. They ran, hearts pounding in their chests, the sound of their footsteps muffled by the thick undergrowth. Emma could hear the growl again, closer this time, louder, angrier. The shadow, whatever it was following them, its presence undeniable. She could feel the air growing heavier, the temperature dropping, and with every step, the woods seemed to darken, like the shadows themselves were reaching out to pull them into the earth. Almost there, Emma panted, her eyes scanning the woods for any sign of the cemetery. Her thoughts were a blur, focused only on the immediate need to survive. But then the growl came again, even louder now, and this time it was joined by something else, a shrill, high-pitched scream, like nails on a chalkboard. The scream pierced the air, filling the woods with an ear-splitting cacophony of terror. "Move, Emma!" Gabriel shouted, but she didn't need to be told. She pushed forward faster, with desperation fueling every step. But the scream was relentless, echoing through the trees, and the ground seemed to shake beneath them, as if the forest itself were coming alive. And then through the trees she saw it. The cemetery. It was a forgotten place, hidden from the world, the gravestones old and weathered, barely legible in the dim light. The iron gate that guarded it was rusted, creaking as it swayed in the wind, the hinges groaning like something waking from a long slumber. Emma's heart soared with a mixture of dread and hope. Dread because she knew they weren't safe yet, but hope because this was the only place where they might find answers, or at least a way to protect themselves. "Go!" Emma urged, tugging Gabriel toward the gate. But just as they reached it, the ground beneath their feet shook again, more violently this time. From the shadows, the figure emerged. It was tall, far too tall, and its form was distorted, as if it were made of darkness itself, its body flickering in and out of view. Its eyes gleamed with a sickly yellow glow, and its teeth, long and sharp, glistened in the faint light. The creature moved with a jerky, unnatural motion, its limbs twitching as though they were not meant to bend in such a way. Emma froze, terror seizing her chest. Gabriel screamed, stumbling back, but the creature was already upon them, its hand reaching out with unnatural speed. "Run!" Emma screamed, shoving Gabriel forward. They had no time to waste. The gate was open now, but the creature was gaining on them. Together, they sprinted into the cemetery, desperate for refuge. The entity was right behind them, its growl deafening, its presence overpowering. But there was something else in the cemetery, something old. As they ran past the gravestones, Emma could feel it. An energy, ancient and powerful, that seemed to hum beneath the earth. It wasn't the entity that had been chasing them. It was something else. Over there, Gabriel yelled, pointing to a large, stone mausoleum at the center of the cemetery. The door was ajar, and there was no time to waste. Without thinking, Emma pushed open the heavy door, and they both stumbled inside, slamming it shut behind them just as the creature reached the entrance. The world outside was drowned in an eerie silence, but inside, Emma's heart hammered in her chest. "We're safe for now," Gabriel said, his voice shaky with relief. But Emma wasn't so sure. The mausoleum was cold, its stone walls lined with ancient coffins and crypts. There was no light here, only the faintest glow from the cracks in the stone. And the presence of the curse, the entity, still lingered, pressing in on them. "We can't stay here forever," Emma whispered, her eyes scanning the dark corners of the mausoleum. "There's something here, something we need to find." Gabriel nodded, but his face was pale. He could feel it too, the energy that pulsed through the air, ancient and heavy. It was waiting. But waiting for what? The silence in the mausoleum was overwhelming, pressing in on them like the thickest fog. Emma's breath echoed in the stillness, a reminder that they weren't alone, not truly. The walls, covered in ivy and damp from centuries of neglect, seemed to close in around them as they stood in the heart of the crypt. There was a faint smell of decay, of earth long forgotten, and the air felt heavier with every passing second. Gabriel was trembling beside her, his eyes scanning the dark corners of the mausoleum. But Emma couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching them, something that knew they were here. "We have to find something," Emma whispered, her voice low but urgent. The very air inside the mausoleum seemed to carry an unspoken warning. She felt drawn toward the far corner, where an ancient-looking stone slab lay, etched with symbols she didn't recognize. The stone was worn down with age, but there was something oddly significant about it, a sense that it was the key to everything. Gabriel's voice was barely a whisper when he spoke. "What is it?" "I don't know," Emma replied, taking a tentative step forward. Her hand brushed against the cold, smooth surface of the slab, and for a brief moment she felt a surge of energy, faint, almost like a pulse, like something alive beneath the stone. Her heart skipped a beat. "Emma," Gabriel's voice cracked with fear as he grabbed her arm, pulling her back from the stone. His eyes were wide, his breath quickening in short bursts. "What the hell is happening?" Emma didn't answer. She was too focused on the stone. The energy in the room had shifted, and she felt it, something old and powerful awakening beneath the earth. The entity from the house was no longer just a distant threat. It was here, in the mausoleum, closing in on them with a hunger that could not be sated. "We need to move," Emma said, her voice steady despite the rising panic inside her. "We need to figure out what this is. It's the only way." She took a step back, forcing herself to pull away from the stone. But as she did, a deep rumble filled the room, a sound like the earth itself was shifting beneath their feet. The temperature dropped, a chill that seeped into their bones. From the shadows in the corners of the mausoleum, dark shapes began to materialize, figures tall and gaunt, their faces obscured by hoods. They moved with slow, deliberate steps, emerging from the darkness as if they were part of it. Emma's heart raced. She couldn't make out their features, but she could feel their presence, unholy, ancient, and full of malice. These weren't ordinary figures. They were something else. Gabriel's breath hitched, his grip tightening on Emma's arm. "What are they? What do they want?" "I don't know," Emma replied, her voice shaky with fear. She backed away slowly, her eyes fixed on the hooded figures, trying to make sense of what she was seeing. The figures didn't speak, didn't move with any urgency. They simply stood there, watching them, silent and cold. The rumbling continued, and Emma realized with a sickening jolt that the mausoleum was alive, shifting in response to the figures' presence. The ground beneath their feet trembled, and a low, guttural growl echoed from the shadows, an unmistakable sound. The entity was here. With a sudden jolt, one of the figures moved forward, its cloak trailing behind it like a shadow. It stopped just a few feet away from Emma, and for the first time, she could see its face. A face that was pale, almost featureless, save for the two dark, empty pits where its eyes should have been. Its skin was stretched tight over its bones, and its mouth opened to reveal rows of razor-sharp teeth, gaping wide in a silent scream. Gabriel recoiled in horror, but Emma stood frozen, her heart hammering in her chest. She could feel the entity now, the presence that had been haunting them since they entered the house, standing right behind her, just inches away. The growl from below had turned into something more distinct, a voice, dark and menacing, whispering in her ear. "You cannot escape," it hissed, the words sending a shiver of dread down her spine. "You're already mine." The hooded figure reached out, its skeletal hand brushing against her shoulder, cold and unfeeling. Emma gasped, jerking away from its touch, but the grip was too strong. Her vision blurred, and for a moment, the world around her seemed to shift, everything spinning, warping, until she was no longer standing in the mausoleum, but somewhere else entirely. She was standing in a room, dark and cold, its walls lined with strange symbols and runes. The air was thick with an unsettling energy, and in the center of the room stood a large, ornate altar, covered in blackened, dried blood. And there at the altar stood a figure, tall, cloaked, its face obscured by a dark hood. Its hands were raised, as if in the midst of some ancient ritual. Emma's breath caught in her throat as she recognized the figure. It was the entity. But it was different here, more solid, more real. Its form was no longer a shadow, but a creature, an ancient being that had existed long before the house, long before Blackwood Manor. "This is where it began," the voice whispered, filling her mind with images of the past. She could see flashes, strange rituals, blood sacrifices, and the figure that had called upon the entity. The power, the curse, it was all tied to this place, to the very foundation of Blackwood Manor. "You cannot escape what you are," the voice continued, its words now clear. "The curse is eternal. The blood is forever." Suddenly, the vision shifted again, and Emma was back in the mausoleum, gasping for breath. Her hands were trembling, and the figures were still there, watching her, their eyes empty, their mouths stretched in grim smiles. Gabriel was beside her, his face pale and sweaty. "What happened?" Gabriel asked, his voice hoarse. "I saw it," Emma said, her voice shaking. "I saw where it all began. The ritual, the blood, the curse. It's tied to the very foundation of this place." Gabriel swallowed hard. "What do we do now?" Emma's mind raced. They couldn't fight it, not directly, not with the entity this powerful. But there had to be a way. The mausoleum, the symbols on the stone, everything was connected. They needed to find the source, the key to breaking the curse before it was too late. "We need to destroy it," she said, her voice firm despite the terror clawing at her chest. "We need to destroy whatever it is that binds the curse to this place." Gabriel nodded, his expression determined. "Let's do it. Whatever it takes." They turned toward the stone slab, their only hope now resting on unraveling the mystery of the curse and finding the strength to survive what was hunting them. Emma's gaze locked onto the stone slab once more, its surface now seeming to pulse with a faint, unnatural energy. The symbols etched into it, while worn and faded by time, seemed to shimmer slightly under the dim light, filtering in through the cracks of the mausoleum. The air around them was thick, and the presence of the entity, whatever it truly was, felt closer, its oppressive weight pressing in on them from every angle. "Are you sure?" Gabriel whispered, his voice shaky as he glanced at the slab. He could see the shift in Emma's expression, a mixture of determination and fear. Emma nodded, her breath shallow. "We have no choice. This is it. This is where it all began." She ran her fingers along the cold surface of the stone, tracing the intricate symbols, as though trying to decipher the ancient language that bound it. Gabriel watched her carefully, his nerves on edge, but he trusted Emma. She had proven time and again that she could think through the horrors they faced. Still, doubt gnawed at him. There was something unsettling about the slab, like it was alive in some way, and the fact that it seemed to respond to Emma's touch only made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. Suddenly, a low growl sounded from somewhere outside the mausoleum, sending a jolt of panic through both of them. The entity was closing in. It was coming. "We don't have much time," Emma muttered, her fingers now pressing harder into the stone, trying to make sense of the symbols. Each touch sent a strange jolt of energy through her body, making her skin tingle uncomfortably. "Maybe we should," Gabriel began, but his voice faltered as the growl grew louder, its source closer now. He couldn't explain it, but the very sound seemed to reverberate through his chest, like it was vibrating the air itself. Before he could finish his thought, Emma's hand landed on a particularly large symbol, one that was etched deeper than the others. The moment her fingers brushed against it, the ground beneath them rumbled once more, and the stone slab shifted. A sharp, grating sound filled the air, as if the very mausoleum itself was waking from a long slumber. Gabriel stepped back instinctively, his heart racing. "What did you do?" "I didn't do anything." Emma shot back, her voice tinged with frustration and fear. "It's the curse. It's reacting to something in the air, something we can't see, but it's there. I can feel it." The stone beneath her fingers continued to shift, grinding against itself, and slowly, almost impossibly, the slab began to lift. The air around them thickened, and a gust of cold wind swept through the mausoleum, extinguishing the last remnants of the light. It was as though the very room was holding its breath, waiting for something. In the silence that followed, Emma swallowed hard. "I think it's opening." Just as she said those words, a blinding light erupted from the space beneath the slab. Emma and Gabriel both stumbled back, shielding their eyes from the intense glow. The light was almost blinding, white, pure, and filled with an otherworldly energy that felt like it was reaching deep into their souls. From within the depths of the stone, something began to emerge. A figure cloaked in shadow, but not quite solid, like an ancient, forgotten memory being pulled from the depths of the earth. Its form shifted in and out of clarity, but its presence was undeniable. The air hummed with its power, an ancient energy older than the house itself. Emma's heart pounded in her chest as she took a step forward, her eyes locked on the figure. It was tall, too tall. Its features were indistinct, nothing more than a blur of darkness and light, but the feeling it emanated was unmistakable. This was the source, the curse, the thing that had tied Blackwood Manor to the entity. Before Emma could speak, the figure extended a hand toward them, its fingers long and twisted. "You should not have come," a voice whispered, a sound so low and terrifying that it seemed to echo inside her skull. It wasn't just words, it was a command, a warning, and yet it carried with it an undeniable sense of finality. Emma's chest tightened. This thing, it wasn't just an entity. It was ancient, powerful, and it was angry. "We need to stop it," Emma hissed, gripping Gabriel's arm with desperation. But the moment she touched him, the world around them shifted again, and the mausoleum seemed to warp. The walls twisted, the gravestones outside growing larger, closer. The shadows deepened, closing in on them like a suffocating blanket. "We can't." Gabriel's voice cracked as he struggled to free himself from her grip. "Whatever this is, it's too strong." But Emma wasn't listening. Her gaze locked on the figure as it moved closer, its form becoming more distinct with every step. It raised its other hand, and the ground trembled once more, as if responding to the energy it was summoning. The creature, this thing, was not only the source of the curse, it was the curse. Its form was so massive now that it seemed to engulf everything around them, bending the very fabric of reality. Emma felt herself being drawn toward it, her body weightless, as if the gravitational pull of the entity was too strong to resist. "No!" Gabriel shouted, but his voice was weak, lost beneath the oppressive force that surrounded them. He grabbed Emma's arm, trying to pull her back, but she was already slipping, her feet no longer touching the ground. In that moment, she understood. The entity wasn't just hunting them, it was using them, pulling them into its fold, weaving their fates into the very fabric of its curse. And there was no escape. The figure loomed over them now, its face finally becoming clear. Its eyes were empty voids, dark and endless, a reflection of the abyss itself. The air hummed with dark energy as it stared down at them, as if appraising their souls, calculating their worth. "You are already part of this place," the entity's voice boomed in their minds. "Your blood has already been spilled." Emma could barely breathe, the weight of its presence suffocating her. "No, we're not part of this." But the entity only smiled, a twisted, ghastly grin that seemed to stretch impossibly wide across its face. "You were always part of it. You are bound by the bloodline. The curse never truly ends." A force, colder than death itself, surged through Emma, locking her in place. Her body was frozen, her thoughts jumbled, and yet through the haze of terror, she managed to hear the faintest whisper in her mind. "You must stop it. Destroy the stone. Break the curse." But before she could react, the entity's voice filled her mind once more, drowning out the whispers. "It's too late." Suddenly, the darkness closed in, swallowing her whole. The entity's grip on Emma and Gabriel tightened, as if the very air had turned to liquid stone, imprisoning them in its suffocating hold. Emma's chest felt like it was being crushed under an immense weight, and her vision began to blur. She could still hear the growl of the entity, its voice echoing in her mind like 1,000 whispers from a forgotten realm. "Too late," the voice repeated, each syllable dragging them deeper into the abyss. "You are already mine." Gabriel's desperate cries were muffled, his attempts to break free of the invisible force surrounding them futile. Emma tried to focus, to push against the suffocating darkness, but it was as if she were sinking into a nightmare, her body immobilized and her mind growing clouded with dread. Her heart pounded in her chest, but the sound was distorted, faint, as though the very life was being drained from her. Then, through the haze, she heard it again, the whisper. It wasn't the entity, but something else. Something distant, almost too soft to be real. But it was there, just beneath the surface of her panic. "Destroy the stone. The blood. The curse." The words sliced through the fog in her mind like a blade. The stone. The stone beneath the slab. The one that had awakened the entity. The whisper was clear now, and Emma realized it was not just a plea, it was a command. She had to destroy it. Without thinking, she forced her limbs to move, breaking through the force that had paralyzed her. She could feel Gabriel still beside her, struggling against the unseen hold, but she couldn't afford to worry about him. This was their only chance. Her hand found its way back to the stone slab, still pulsing with an unnatural energy. She could see the symbols on it more clearly now, glowing faintly in the darkness, an eerie radiance emanating from the stone's surface. But there was something else, something more insidious, buried within the stone, something that felt like it was pulsing with malevolent life. Emma placed her hand on the stone again, forcing herself to focus. Her fingertips burned as if the stone itself were alive and fighting against her touch. The whispers in her mind grew louder, more insistent. The bloodline must be severed. Her blood ran cold. The curse, the entity, it was tied to her, to Gabriel, to everything about this place. The mansion, the crypt, the entire land. This had all been part of some ancient ritual, some forgotten pact. The bloodline of Blackwood Manor had been cursed for generations, and Emma and Gabriel had unwittingly walked into its grasp. "No!" Emma shouted aloud, her voice breaking through the oppressive weight that surrounded her. She wasn't going to be part of this. She wasn't going to let the entity claim them. She dug her fingers into the stone, pulling at the symbols, desperately searching for a weakness. And then her fingers brushed something soft, something that shouldn't have been there. It was like fabric, delicate, fragile, and yet it pulsed with an energy far more terrifying than anything she had felt before. With a sense of urgency, Emma pulled at it, forcing her hand into the stone. Something gave way beneath her touch, and the stone cracked open with a deafening roar. A burst of cold, unholy energy exploded outward, sending Emma staggering back. The ground beneath her feet trembled violently, and she felt the stone wall of the mausoleum shift, as if it, too, were fighting against the force being released. Gabriel was still struggling, his face contorted in pain, but he managed to get to his feet and rushed to her side. "Emma, what did you do?" His voice was filled with panic. Emma didn't answer. She was too focused on the dark, swirling vortex that was now opening before her, its edges flickering with black flames, its center pulling her toward it. It was the curse, the source of the entity's power. She could feel it trying to drag her into the very heart of its chaos, but something inside her, something primal and defiant, refused to let it. She could see now, beyond the stone, beyond the darkness, a figure emerging from the center of the vortex. It was the entity, but this time it was no longer a shadow. It was solid, towering, and grotesque. Its form was impossibly large, its body writhing with tendrils of black smoke that snaked toward Emma, each one a physical manifestation of its dark power. Gabriel's voice cut through her panic. "Emma, we have to finish it. Whatever you did, it's not enough yet." The words shook her from her daze, and Emma realized he was right. She hadn't destroyed it. The entity was only getting stronger. The stone had been broken, but the curse was still alive, still hungry. She had to sever the bloodline, sever the tie between the entity and Blackwood Manor. Without thinking, Emma reached for the pendant that hung around her neck, the pendant she had inherited from her mother, passed down through generations. It had always been a strange comfort, something she'd never fully understood, but now, in this moment of terrifying clarity, she knew what it was. The pendant was the key. She ripped it from her neck and held it up to the dark vortex. The instant the pendant made contact with the swirling black flames, the entire mausoleum trembled violently. The entity screamed, an ear-piercing, guttural sound that shook the very walls of the crypt. The black tendrils recoiled, and the vortex began to contract, its power weakening. "No!" The voice of the entity boomed, furious and desperate. "You cannot." But Emma didn't give it the chance to finish. She thrust the pendant into the heart of the vortex, and with a deafening explosion, the entire mausoleum shook as though the very foundations of Blackwood Manor were being torn apart. The entity's screams grew louder, then more distant, fading into the void. And then suddenly everything stopped. The mausoleum fell silent. Emma and Gabriel stood in the midst of the chaos, breathing heavily, their bodies still trembling with the aftershocks of the battle. The ground beneath them was still, and the air had returned to its previous stillness. But the oppressive presence of the entity was gone, as if it had never existed. For a moment, Emma could barely believe it. Had they done it? Had they truly destroyed the curse? Gabriel looked around, his face pale but relieved. "Is it over?" Emma didn't answer right away. She was still trying to make sense of everything, her heart still racing in her chest. But as she glanced at the broken stone slab and the now still vortex, she knew they had done it. The curse had been severed, the entity banished back into whatever void it had come from. But there was something else, something beneath the surface. She could still feel the lingering presence of the curse, like an echo, faint but persistent. She knew that it would take time for the land to heal, for the mansion and the crypt to truly be free. And yet, for the first time in what felt like forever, Emma felt a glimmer of hope. They had survived, but the cost had been great. The curse had taken so much from them, so many secrets, so many lost souls, and Emma knew that some scars would never truly fade. As she and Gabriel made their way out of the mausoleum, the sun began to rise on the horizon, casting its first light on the shattered ruins of Blackwood Manor. It was over, but the silence, the eerie stillness that followed, would never truly leave them. As Emma and Gabriel stepped out of the mausoleum, the early morning light filtered through the trees, casting long, eerie shadows over the overgrown path that led back to the manor. The nightmarish events of the last few hours were still fresh in their minds, and yet, as they stood there, bathed in the soft glow of dawn, there was an undeniable sense of quiet, unnatural, almost as though the world itself were holding its breath. The air was still heavy, thick with the remnants of the curse that had once hung over Blackwood Manor. Emma glanced at Gabriel, his face pale but filled with a quiet determination. He was no longer the man who had arrived at the mansion full of hope and curiosity. The horrors they had uncovered had changed him, changed them both. They were survivors now, marked by the curse but free from its clutches, for the moment at least. Gabriel looked up at the mansion, his gaze lingering on the crumbling stone walls that seemed to breathe in the morning light. "Do you think it's really over?" His voice was low, almost a whisper. Emma's eyes narrowed as she took in the sight of the manor. The place was as still as death, the windows dark and empty, the facade of the house now devoid of its former sinister energy. But despite its outward appearance, Emma couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching them, that the curse hadn't truly released its hold. "I don't know," she said quietly. "I think there's more to it than we realize." Gabriel turned to her, his brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" Emma hesitated. She could still feel it, the faint pulse of the curse, like an echo that lingered in the air around them. It was a feeling she couldn't explain, a sense that something had shifted but not completely ended. There was more to this house, to the bloodline, than they'd uncovered in the mausoleum. "I don't think the curse was just the entity," Emma said, her voice barely a whisper as she turned to face the manor. "The mansion, the land, there's something deeper, older here. The curse was always part of it, but it wasn't the whole story." Gabriel stepped closer, his eyes full of concern. "You're scaring me, Emma." "I'm not trying to," she replied, her voice steadier now. "I just think we need to leave. We need to make sure we've truly severed everything. The entity's gone, yes, but the manor, the land, it's been feeding on that curse for centuries. If we leave now, without doing what needs to be done, who knows what could happen." Gabriel stood there for a long moment, as if considering her words. Finally, he nodded. "All right, let's get out of here. We'll go back to the city. We can't do this alone anymore." Emma smiled faintly at his words. "I don't think we ever could." The two of them began to make their way away from the manor, the air feeling somehow lighter as they walked. For the first time in what felt like forever, Emma allowed herself to take a deep breath, to feel the relief of having survived. They had destroyed the curse, or so they believed. They had freed themselves from the entity's grasp, or so they thought. But even as they reached the edge of the woods, Emma couldn't shake the feeling that something was still lurking, just beyond the reach of the light. The two of them climbed into the car, Emma behind the wheel, Gabriel beside her. The engine roared to life, and they pulled out of the driveway, the ancient mansion fading into the distance. But as the miles passed and they left Blackwood Manor behind, Emma couldn't help but glance in the rearview mirror one last time. For a brief moment, she thought she saw a shadow move in one of the windows. But when she blinked, the shadow was gone. The house was still. It's over, right? Or could Emma's suspicion of something more sinister still linger? As the road stretched out before them, the two of them fell into an uneasy silence. The tires hummed steadily on the asphalt, the only sound in the car as the distance between them and Blackwood Manor grew. Yet, despite the miles, Emma couldn't shake the nagging feeling deep in her chest, the whisper that kept playing on repeat in her mind. Something wasn't right. The sun had fully risen by the time they reached the outskirts of town. The streets seemed normal, bustling with the mundane rhythm of everyday life. People walked their dogs, cars passed by, and children played in the parks. To anyone else, it would appear as though the horrors they had faced were nothing but a bad dream. But for Emma, the world had irrevocably changed. She had been marked, scarred by what she had seen and experienced in the cursed walls of Blackwood Manor. She glanced over at Gabriel, his face still pale but more relaxed than it had been in hours. He was staring out the window, lost in thought. Emma wanted to ask him if he was okay, if he too could feel the unease that clung to her, but she didn't. She didn't want to voice the lingering fear that she wasn't sure she could explain. As they turned onto a quieter side street, Emma's hand tightened on the wheel. The car felt too small now, too confined. The silence between them stretched, heavy and thick, as if something invisible was pressing in on them. Suddenly, her phone buzzed in the cup holder. Emma flinched, the noise breaking through the suffocating tension that had settled over the car. She reached for her phone, glancing at the screen. It was a text message from her mother. "Are you okay? We haven't heard from you since last night. I'm worried." Emma's stomach churned. She hadn't been able to contact her family, not since the first night at Blackwood Manor. The strange happenings, the entity, it had all consumed her, and now, as if by instinct, she hadn't even thought to reach out to let them know she was safe. She typed a quick reply, trying to keep the message calm, even though her heart was pounding in her chest. "I'm okay. Gabriel and I made it out. We'll explain when we get home." She hit send, but as soon as the message left her phone, she felt a sudden coldness settle over her, as if the warmth of the sun outside had disappeared. The chill was so sudden, it was almost physical. Emma shivered, her fingers tightening around the steering wheel. "Are you all right?" Gabriel's voice broke through her dazed state, and she turned to look at him. He was staring at her with concern in his eyes, his hand resting lightly on her arm. "I don't know," Emma said, her voice shaky. I feel like we're still being watched. It's like the curse is following us." Gabriel frowned, his brows knitting together. "You think the entity followed us?" Emma shook her head. "No, I don't think it's that. It's something else. It's as if the land, the house, it's still with us somehow. Like a shadow that won't let go." Gabriel didn't say anything for a long while. His gaze turned to the window again, as if he was searching for something in the passing scenery, trying to make sense of the words that Emma had said. But then, after a few moments, he spoke again. "I'm not sure what's going on, but I know we need to be careful. Whatever we awakened in that place, whatever we disturbed, it's not something that's just going to go away. Emma nodded. She didn't know how to explain it, but she knew he was right. The curse might have been broken, but it had left its mark on them. It had to have. Nothing this dark, this old, could just disappear. And then, as they drove further into town, something caught Emma's eye in the rearview mirror. It was quick, too quick to be real, but she could have sworn she saw movement. A figure standing at the edge of the road, partially obscured by a streetlight. It was too far away to make out any details, but the figure was tall, unnaturally so, and its shape was distorted in a way that made her heart skip a beat. "Did you see that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Gabriel turned to look, following her gaze. "See what?" The figure was gone. The street was empty now. Emma's pulse raced as she continued to drive, her grip tightening on the wheel. She tried to tell herself it was just a trick of the light, but the uneasy feeling in her chest refused to go away. She felt it like a presence, something watching, something waiting. As they entered the heart of town, the atmosphere seemed to shift again. The quiet, peaceful streets, the sunlight streaming down, all of it began to feel wrong. Emma's skin prickled with the sensation of being hunted, and the feeling wasn't limited to her. Gabriel, too, seemed to sense it, his body tense, his eyes darting back and forth as if expecting something to jump out at them. "We need to get back to my place," Emma said, her voice urgent. "Something's not right. We're not safe yet." Gabriel nodded silently, his lips pressed into a thin line as he turned to look out the window. His hand gripped the seat tightly, his knuckles white. They didn't speak again for the rest of the drive, both lost in their own thoughts. By the time they arrived at Emma's apartment, the feeling of dread had reached a fever pitch. The apartment, normally a haven for her, now felt oppressive, the walls too close, the air too thick. Emma pushed the door open, the familiar scent of home greeting her, but it did little to calm the unease clawing at her mind. She led Gabriel inside, and the moment they stepped over the threshold, a sense of suffocating tension settled in the room. It was as if something had followed them, something that had not yet been banished, still lurking in the shadows, still waiting. Emma locked the door behind them, her heart racing. She tried to ignore the creeping feeling, but it was impossible. Whatever had been unleashed in Blackwood Manor, whatever had followed them, was still there, at the edge of her perception, just beyond her reach. She turned to Gabriel. "We need to make sure it's really gone. We need to break whatever connection we have to that place. And we need to do it now." Gabriel looked back at her, his expression grim. "I don't think we're ever going to be free of it, Emma." She swallowed hard, staring at him. "I don't care. I won't stop until it's gone. Until we're free." But deep down, Emma couldn't shake the nagging feeling that no matter what they did, the curse had found a new home. And it wasn't just Blackwood Manor. It was in them now. As the night descended upon the apartment, the air inside felt thick, almost suffocating. The clock on the wall ticked away the seconds, but it sounded like the echo of something far darker, like the ticking of a clock in an empty, abandoned place. Emma paced back and forth, unable to sit still. Her thoughts were tangled, and every time she glanced over at Gabriel, he seemed more distant, more withdrawn. The weight of what had happened hung over them both. "We need to do something," Emma muttered, more to herself than to Gabriel. He didn't respond immediately. His eyes were fixed on the window, where the last vestiges of daylight had disappeared, leaving only the faint glimmer of city lights. The room felt colder now, as if the warmth had been sucked out of it. Gabriel shivered involuntarily, rubbing his arms as though trying to ward off a chill that wasn't there. "I know," he said softly. "But what? What can we do now? We've already broken the curse. We went to the mausoleum, we did everything. But it's like there's still something lingering, something we missed." Emma froze mid-step. The realization hit her like a jolt of electricity. We missed something. We didn't finish it. Gabriel turned toward her, a flicker of hope in his eyes. What do you mean? Emma took a deep breath, the words coming in a rush as she pieced together what had been bothering her since they left the manor. The curse wasn't just a spirit or an entity. It was tied to the land, to the very fabric of Blackwood Manor. The land itself is cursed, its soil, its stones, everything. Even if we broke the connection with the entity, we didn't destroy the foundation of the curse. Gabriel's face paled. So you're saying we have to go back? To the manor? Emma nodded grimly. Yes, it's the only way to be sure. We have to destroy the land itself, the source of the curse. Gabriel stood up slowly, his body tense as he considered her words. And if we don't, what happens then? She hesitated, not wanting to voice the horrible thoughts swirling in her mind. It's never really gone. We'll always be connected to it, and it could come back stronger. It might never stop chasing us. The weight of the situation pressed down on them both, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke. The idea of going back to Blackwood Manor seemed insane, almost suicidal after everything they had been through. But Emma was certain, absolutely certain, that this was the only way. The curse hadn't finished with them yet. It had just taken a new form, a new strategy. We're not safe here, Gabriel, she finally said, her voice steady despite the fear bubbling inside her. We have to go back, and we have to destroy everything. Gabriel met her gaze, his eyes tired, but there was a flicker of resolve in them. He didn't hesitate. Let's go. They didn't waste any more time. The drive back to the manor was silent, each of them lost in their thoughts, the gravity of their decision hanging heavily in the air. The city lights slowly faded into the distance as they drove toward the dark stretch of countryside that led to Blackwood Manor. The trees on either side of the road seemed to close in on them, and the air grew colder the closer they got to their destination. As they approached the familiar, foreboding silhouette of the mansion, Emma felt a knot of dread tighten in her chest. The house loomed in the distance, its dark windows like hollow eyes staring into the night. It had been the site of their terror, the place where they had uncovered the secrets of the curse. And now it called them back. They parked the car in the same spot as before, the gravel crunching beneath the tires. Emma grabbed the bag she had packed earlier, a small duffel bag containing whatever they might need. The unease that had been lingering since they left the manor was now palpable, like something was breathing down her neck, waiting. Stay close, Emma whispered as she led the way toward the entrance. The door to Blackwood Manor stood open, as if inviting them in, but Emma couldn't help but feel that it was no invitation at all. It was a trap waiting to spring. They had already been in the heart of it, and yet the feeling of being watched was stronger than ever. Inside the mansion, the air was thick with dust, the smell of decay lingering in the walls. The silence was unnerving, as if the house had been holding its breath for years. The once grand foyer, with its towering ceilings and elegant chandeliers, now appeared like a crumbling shell of its former self. Everything was coated in grime and neglect, but there was a palpable sense of malevolent energy, a hum that buzzed under the floorboards, under the very stones. Emma moved forward, her footsteps slow but deliberate. Gabriel followed behind her, his eyes darting nervously from corner to corner, as if expecting something to leap out of the shadows. He gripped the bag tightly in his hand, the weight of their mission sinking in. We need to find the center of it, Emma murmured, more to herself than to Gabriel. Wherever the curse is rooted, the heart of this place. We have to destroy it completely. The house seemed to respond to her words, groaning as if it were alive. The walls creaked and shifted, the floorboards echoing under their feet. The temperature dropped even further, and Emma could see her breath in the cold air. It was as if the mansion was reacting to their presence, aware of their intentions. Suddenly, a voice broke the silence. "Why are you back?" Emma's heart stopped. The voice was low, guttural, like a whisper carried on the wind. It wasn't Gabriel. It wasn't anyone she recognized. It was the voice of the house itself. She turned to look at Gabriel, who had frozen, his wide eyes searching the room for the source of the sound. "It's the house," Emma whispered, barely able to breathe. "It's speaking to us." The voice came again, this time louder, more insistent. "You cannot leave," it said. "You are part of it now." Emma's blood ran cold. She knew in that instant that the curse was not something that could be defeated by merely breaking the connection with the entity. The house, the land, the very stones of Blackwood Manor, they were all cursed. And as long as they were here, they were still tied to it. "We have to finish this," Emma said, her voice shaking. "Now." But the house had other plans. The walls began to shift, the floorboards buckling and groaning, as if the house itself were trying to expel them, to trap them inside forever. Emma's breath quickened, her pulse racing as the walls seemed to close in around them. The shifting of the floorboards echoed in her ears like 100 footsteps, and a low, almost primal growl rumbled from deep within the mansion. The house was alive, and it was angry. "Gabriel," Emma hissed, grabbing his arm. "We need to get to the center. The mausoleum. It's the only way." Gabriel nodded quickly, his face pale, his hand gripping hers tightly as they moved deeper into the house. Every shadow seemed to pulse with malice, and Emma could feel the cold touch of unseen fingers trailing down her neck. She kept her eyes forward, unwilling to look at the dark corners, at the things that moved when she wasn't looking. The mansion was watching them, following their every move. They made their way down the long hallway, past the decaying rooms that had once been filled with the laughter of a family long forgotten. The grand staircase loomed ahead, leading up to the upper floors where the master bedroom and the study had been. But Emma knew that the real heart of the curse lay below them, in the basement where the mausoleum was hidden. The air grew heavier with each step, thick and oppressive, as if the house itself was pushing against them, trying to drive them back. The voice, deep and mocking, whispered again, this time from all around them. "You think you can destroy me," it taunted. "You are already mine. You always have been." Emma clenched her jaw, refusing to acknowledge the voice. It was a lie. She had to believe that. They had broken the connection. They had destroyed the entity. And now they just needed to rid the house of its curse. If they could destroy the mausoleum, the foundation of the house's evil, they could free themselves, and everyone else who might one day find themselves in the same position. They reached the door leading to the basement. It was the same door they had passed through before, but now it looked more foreboding. The wood was darkened, almost black, as if stained by years of sorrow and bloodshed. Emma reached for the handle, but before she could touch it, the door swung open on its own. There was no one on the other side, only darkness. Emma hesitated for a moment, her heart pounding in her chest. Gabriel was right behind her, his breath ragged with fear, but his hand was steady on her back, urging her forward. Without another word, she stepped into the darkness of the basement. The temperature dropped immediately, the chill settling into her bones as they descended into the blackened depths. The stairs creaked under their weight, each step a reminder of the house's decay. Emma's flashlight flickered, casting long shadows that danced and shifted as if alive. They reached the bottom of the stairs, and before them lay the mausoleum, the same one they had found during their first night here. But now it was different. The stone that had once seemed ancient and unmoving now looked as if it was alive, its cracks widening and closing as though breathing. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth, and Emma felt a pressure on her chest, as though something was pushing her to her knees. The walls seemed to close in around them, and the voice of the house echoed through the stone, reverberating off the walls. "You cannot destroy me," it said, its tone low and menacing. "I am eternal. I was here long before you, and I will remain long after you are gone." Emma swallowed, her hand tightening around the flashlight. She glanced at Gabriel, who was staring at the mausoleum with wide eyes. The fear in his expression mirrored her own, but beneath that fear, she could see something else, determination. "We can end this," Emma said, her voice trembling but firm. "We can break it. We just need to finish it." Gabriel nodded, swallowing hard. Together, they approached the mausoleum, and Emma's heart raced in her chest. The stone seemed to pulse beneath her touch, cold and unforgiving. She could feel the weight of the curse pressing down on her, trying to force her away, but she steeled herself. This had to be done. It had to be finished. She pulled the small dagger from her bag, the one they had found in the attic earlier. It gleamed in the dim light, its steel reflecting the faint glow of their flashlight. She raised it, holding it above the mausoleum, and with a deep breath, she thrust the dagger into the stone. The moment the blade made contact, the room seemed to explode with energy. The air crackled with a sudden force, and a violent tremor ran through the floor. The walls of the basement began to shake, and Emma staggered, almost losing her balance. The house itself seemed to scream, the sound piercing her ears, but she held firm, keeping her grip on the dagger. "Come on," she muttered, her voice strained. "Just a little more." Gabriel stepped forward, his hand resting on her shoulder. "We have to finish it. We have to destroy the source." Together, they pressed the dagger deeper into the stone. The mausoleum shuddered violently, and suddenly, the ground beneath them cracked open, revealing a hidden chamber beneath. Emma gasped, pulling the dagger free as a burst of black smoke poured out from the opening. The air was thick, suffocating, as the smoke curled around them like serpents, trying to bind them in its grasp. The voice of the house came again, louder this time, filled with rage. "No! You cannot! You will not escape!" Emma felt the air grow colder, the darkness closing in around her. But she wasn't afraid anymore. The house could try to hold them, but it wouldn't win. Not now. She thrust the dagger into the heart of the opening, and with a sharp, violent crack, the stone shattered. A deafening roar filled the basement as the curse exploded outward, a surge of energy that tore through the walls and floor. The very foundations of the house began to crumble, the air growing thick with dust and debris. Emma and Gabriel stumbled backward, barely able to keep their footing as the house screamed one last time. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, everything went quiet. The darkness began to recede, and the oppressive weight that had clung to the house for so long began to lift. Emma gasped for air, her lungs burning, but she didn't care. She turned to Gabriel, who was standing beside her, his face pale but filled with disbelief. "It's over," she whispered. Gabriel nodded slowly, his hand gripping hers tightly. "It's finally over." The house around them was silent, the oppressive presence gone. The curse, the darkness, the terror, it was all gone. For the first time in what felt like forever, the air felt clean, fresh. The weight had been lifted, and they were free. But as they stood in the ruins of Blackwood Manor, Emma couldn't shake the feeling that they had just survived something far darker than they would ever truly understand. But for now they were safe, and that was all that mattered, at least for now. As the dust settled in the silent remnants of Blackwood Manor, Emma and Gabriel remained frozen in place, their minds still trying to comprehend the magnitude of what they had just done. The weight of the curse was gone, but a strange, lingering unease held them both captive, as though the house itself had not entirely surrendered. The air was heavy with the aftermath, nothing but the faint rustle of the wind outside and the distant sounds of the world continuing on. oblivious to the nightmare that had unfolded within the manor's walls. Emma could feel a tingling in her fingertips, a ghost of the malevolent energy they had just fought against. It wasn't a feeling that could be easily shaken off. "We should leave," Gabriel said, his voice quiet, as though speaking too loudly might awaken something that had been left behind. Emma nodded, unable to find her voice. The room had stopped shaking, the air no longer buzzing with energy, but the scars of the battle remained. The deep cracks in the floor, the shattered mausoleum, the remnants of dark power swirling around the edges of the basement, all of it felt like a warning. A reminder that some forces, no matter how thoroughly fought, never truly vanish. They made their way slowly back to the stairs, their footsteps careful, almost reverent, as if any sound too loud might shatter the fragile peace that had settled over the manor. Gabriel's hand lingered on Emma's back, a comforting weight as they ascended the stairs, the faint glow of the flashlight casting long shadows in the dilapidated hallway. The mansion, once imposing and full of life, now felt like a tomb. It was quiet, eerily so. They reached the front door, and as Emma opened it, the cool night air rushed in, carrying with it the scent of rain and the earth. It was a welcome relief, but it also brought with it an unsettling realization. They were leaving, but something in the depths of the manor still called to them. A whisper they couldn't quite place, a pull they couldn't escape. "Do you feel that?" Gabriel's voice was tense as he stepped over the threshold, turning to glance back into the darkened manor. "It's like something's watching us." Emma stood beside him, her body taut, her senses on high alert. The feeling was undeniable, as if the house, now in ruins, still held a part of them, still tethered them to its forsaken walls. "I think we've been marked," she said, her voice low. "Not by the curse itself, but by everything that it touched. It's as if we've taken a part of it with us, something we can never truly escape." Gabriel frowned, clearly unsettled by her words. "What do you mean? Are you saying that we can't go back to our lives? That this thing is still with us?" "I don't know," Emma admitted, her eyes scanning the shadows of the house one last time. "But something feels different now. It's not just the manor, it's us. We've been inside it too long." The air outside was cool, but it didn't seem to clear the heaviness that lingered in the pit of Emma's stomach. The manor behind them stood in stark contrast to the world around them, like an old, forgotten nightmare too vast and ancient to ever truly disappear. She tried to push the thought away, but it gnawed at her. Something was still there, waiting. A distant rumble of thunder broke the silence, and the first drops of rain began to fall. It was a cleansing rain, a final punctuation on everything that had happened, yet it didn't feel like an end. It felt more like a pause, an uncertain moment before a final act in a story still unfolding. Gabriel's hand found hers again, and though she felt the lingering weight of the curse in her bones, a part of her knew that whatever the future held, they would face it together. "We'll figure this out," Gabriel said firmly, though the hint of doubt in his eyes betrayed his words. "We've come this far." "I hope so," Emma whispered, her gaze still fixed on the now dark house. "I hope so." With one final glance over her shoulder, she took a deep breath and stepped away from Blackwood Manor, leaving behind the nightmare that had haunted them for so long. But even as they drove away, Emma couldn't shake the feeling that the road ahead wouldn't be as simple as returning to their lives. There was something unfinished about all of this, something deeper lurking in the shadows. As the rain fell harder, washing away the remnants of the past, Emma stared out the window, the dark silhouette of the manor disappearing behind them. Her thoughts churned with unanswered questions, but one thing was certain. Blackwood Manor was no longer just a place. It was a story, and their story wasn't over yet. Not by a long shot.